This episode brought to you by How to Write Manga, your complete guide to the secrets of Japanese comic book storytelling. Available wherever fine ebooks are sold.
The world has gone insane. Cosplayers rule the conventions. Gamers dominate the tabletop and the internet. Sci-fi subjugates the movies, and fantasy rules the bookstore with an iron fist. Only one group can bring order to this unruly mob. A team of uber geeks, masters of the nerdly arts, trained for decades in the hobby shops and basements of the nation. Mobilized by the secret masters, they are the Department of Nerdly Affairs.
Hello, operatives, and welcome to the Department of Nerdly Affairs. I'm your host, Rob Patterson, here with my co-host, Don Chisholm.
May the Force be with you.
And as Don has intimated, tonight we are going to be talking about traveling to distant galaxies, although not the ones he's talking about. Tonight we're going to be talking about Star Trek. And to discuss Star Trek, we've brought in one of the biggest Star Trek fans that we happen to know, Jack Ward.
Am I here? Yes, I am. Thank you so much.
Dude, why is your butt on backwards?
That is a really long materialization sound effect. Should have picked a shorter one. We were waiting 15 seconds before I could say anything. But right. Yes, thank you so much for having me here. I really appreciate it. I am indeed a huge Star Trek nerd.
Mm-hmm.
I'm so much a nerd. I don't call myself a Trekkie. I call myself a Trekker. So there you go. It's a big difference.
That's hardcore.
Well, yeah, that is pretty hardcore. And, okay, so today we're going to be talking about, is Star Trek still relevant? And this is a question that I'm sure many people are considering right now, especially with the new Star Trek series. The Star Trek Discovery is on the horizon as we're recording this. And there's even a pseudo Star Trek series, the Orville, that's also coming around the same time. Which some fans are actually saying they are more excited about than they are to Star Trek Discovery, and that may tie into what we're going to be talking about today, but we'll get to that a little later. So, to discuss whether Star Trek is still relevant, we should probably discuss first how it became relevant in the first place. So let's go back to the 1960s and Star Trek. So, which one of you wants to cover the history? Which one of you wants to talk about the history of Star Trek, of the original series? Who feels more qualified?
Oh, we both probably could, right?
I think you probably could. All right, Jack, since you're the biggest Trekker nerd here, why don't you tell us about the origins of Star Trek, the original series?
Long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. No, that's the wrong one. This lovely gentleman who was a police officer at one point and also a script writer who was a hero he was a pilot who landed a plane in a desert and actually went through and got help. Well, there was tons of people injured and dead. He wasn't. So he had a colorful history, and he became known doing a number of different shows. And I guess he got to the point of saying, I want to do a wagon train to the stars. Whether that is actually truly what he said originally, that became the history of what he told everybody.
Well, at the time, remember, Westerns were still king. And
yes.
So it makes sense to actually portray something in a Western paradigm. I mean, that the executives would understand.
Absolutely, and that's the story he's told people. Some people say it's apocryphal afterwards, but that's what the story he's told people, that it was a big time for Westerns, and that's why he could sell it that way. Right. So he put together his money and he shot them a pilot. He did it in Desilu Productions or Desilu Industries. I'm not sure what they're.
Desilu Productions Studios would it
Studio, yeah. Desilu Studios, which is of course the I Love Lucy crowd.
Yeah,
so Desi Arnaz, Lucille Ball. Yeah. So that's where it comes from, and great story there from Lucy about when she was asking about the pilot. But that's afterwards. So they did the pilot, which was called renamed. It was called The Menagerie, and they renamed it later on when they put it in the show to save money in a 2-parter called The Cage.
Yep.
And he had hired this guy, Leonard Nimoy, to be a Spock, but a more emotional Spock than we knew. He hired his girlfriend at the time, who became later on known as Christine Chappell, Majel Barrett, but started off as number one, the unemotional one. And effectively the network didn't like it. They found it too cerebral. So he had to go back to the drawing board and create a new one, which was at the time, and I don't know if it's done since, unheard of. Usually if your pilot fails, then the show fails. But they found enough interest in it that they actually told him to go back to the drawing board. And by the way, get rid of the guy with the ears, which Leonard ended up keeping. Also got rid of the woman, he said, according to Roddenberry. And he said he married the woman and kept the guy with the ears, and that's how he got it. So,
right.
And she returned in many different instances, including the ship computer and Loxana Troy and a whole bunch of different characters throughout the series.
And
one of them,
she has recorded a complete set of phonetic sounds, so that her voice can be used, and maybe will be used in Discovery, for almost all Star Trek computers and TV shows and whatever else from now on.
Oh, wow.
Well, I don't understand why she's not the voice of Siri. Why don't we have the actual... Anyway, that's something that's always bothered me, is like, we have the Enterprise computer to be our Siri. Why not use that? Maybe we'll come up with that later. So Jeffrey Hunter, the main actor, wanted to be a movie star. His wife actually pushed him out of Star Trek. And so they had to start looking for other actors. And there was this young up-and-coming Canadian actor by the name of William Shatner, who just blew everybody's socks off. And so he became the new captain. And they went through a couple of other doctors. They got rid of the doctor that they had there in the pilot. And the second pilot, Where No Man Has Gone Before, much more action-oriented, actually didn't have Dr. McCoy in it either. But that there was a couple of other characters that didn't come back as well. But it was enough that they got everybody interested, and Star Trek was born. And so then we fast forward. By the way, I'm referencing a really awesome book, by the way, by Herb Solow and Robert Justman, called Inside Star Trek: The Real Story. If you've not read it, totally read it. It's my favorite inside book, and I've read most of them. And Herb was the executive producer with Gene Roddenberry for the first 2 seasons, I think. And Bob Justman, I think, was with them for most of the run as well as an associate producer. And Herb claims that he was so beloved by Gene that that's where Sulu's name comes from. Solo is a bastardization of Sulu. But what was really interesting was they were trying to talk about their show, because they were also there was productions going on in Desilu of Mission Impossible at the same time, right? They both came in, and they were going to 2 different networks. One was going to NBC and one was going to CBS. And Lucille Ball says, so what about that show, Herb, that you're doing, the South Sea show? And he says, Lucy, I don't know what you're talking about. No, she goes, no, the South Sea show, where there's a big marine base, and they're putting on shows like the USO, and for all these people. And he said, no, we don't have a show like that, Lucy. And she goes, yes, you do. It's called Star Trek. Because in Lucille's mind, a Star Trek is when you go to different bases as a star and you perform in different shows.
Oh.
So she didn't even know all the aspects of this at the time. Her being the gentleman that he was, he said, oh, yes, I'll talk to you later about that, Lucille, and or Miss Ball. And so he went and talked to her and sort of fixed her up about exactly what Star Trek was about. And she never forgot again, to her credit. But it was a great little story.
Wow. Makes you wonder if she might have approved it, thinking it was something completely different when it went into production, the pilots and everything.
Well, there's a couple of things that they utilized. They said, for one thing, they thought Star Trek was a real big seller because it sold RC TVs, color TVs, because it was the first fully color television show. They actually, they actually they wanted to be able to utilize the real color in the RCA TV, so it was a showrunner for that particular thing.
Oh my God, I didn't know that. Huh.
Yeah, I'm full of useless information on Star Trek.
I had no idea. That's actually a really good bit of trivia.
That's right.
Now, I suspect there probably were other shows before it that eventually did convert to color, but it might have been the first one that started out in color.
Oh, I mean, you can go take a look at Gunsmoke. You can take a look at Bonanza. They started off in black and white, right? Yep. And then they moved to color later on as well. But Star Trek was the first one that started in color and continued through in color as well. So even Gilligan's Island started off in black and white.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. I did know that, yeah. Yeah, that's true. Wow, that's fantastic. There's a great bit of trivia, Jack.
So this show, this little show, actually didn't do super well in its first run. It had its fans, but the network didn't like it so much. They moved it around, and it got moved to the grave shift, which was Friday nights, because most of the people that were watching it were college-age students, and so they knew that and they also kept cutting back their budget, so that's why you see some really terrible episodes in the third season. And I'm looking at Spectre of the Gun and thinking, anyway. But there were some really incredible things that happened. For example, Nichelle Nicols, there's a very famous story about how she was going to leave the show because she was sold it as truly, a collaboration with all the different actors coming together. It was all of them going to be a part of it, and there was this push and pull at the time that Shatner was the star, Nimoy was the star, and they were always battling about stuff like that, and somewhat friendly too. There was some really interesting jokes that Shatner played on Nimoy. I don't know if you know the very famous bicycle story.
Where he kept stealing his bicycle, wasn't it?
Yeah, what happened was, I guess, because Leonard Nimoy had spent so much time in makeup, when he didn't get a lot of chance to eat. Like, he was there at like 6 in the morning trying to get stuff up. And apparently the other side of the lot, like way the heck down, was where they were going to eat at the cafeteria for lunch break. And lunch break was, very solid. Okay, that's 30 minutes for lunch or an hour for lunch. And if he didn't go at that time and get there at that time, he'd miss out. So he brought himself a bicycle because he wanted to get there fast. But Shatner would have no part of it. So the first time he actually locked up the bicycle. So he came and there was a big chain around the bicycle and he couldn't go. So then he decided that, that he would move it somewhere so that people could find that he had the chain. And then he came in and the bicycle was nowhere to be seen. And of course he looks at Bill Shatner, who's this, I guess, massive jokester. And he's like, I don't know what you're talking about. Oh, yes, of course, Leonard. I'm sorry. It's in the bicycle is in my dressing room. Why don't you go in there? Here's the keys and do it. Well, Bill Shatner loves dogs, and I guess he had some pretty nasty dogs sitting in his dressing room, just waiting for Leonard Nimoy to show up, which he didn't. Right? There was another time when Leonard Nimoy said, "Okay, I'm not going to trust this." He put it in his car and left it in the parking lot. He goes, when they were talking about this, I guess Bill sort of sat there and said, I'm not saying I had his car towed. But he totally had his car towed, right? So, and then I guess the last time, this kept going like every day. Poor Shatner was tormenting poor Nimoy. And I guess the last time, and he's like, okay, Bill, where's my bike? And he said, Leonard, my friend, look to the heavens for your answer. And sure enough, he had it up on wires sticking up above the stage, and he couldn't get it down. So he just gave up. He packed his own lunch or something. He couldn't beat William Shatner. And they were good friends until Leonard's death, and Leonard still had this bile in his stomach from this terrible series of practical jokes that William Shatner played on him at the time. Right. But the Nichelle Nichols story is also extremely famous, where she wasn't getting the lines, and she decided she was going to leave the show. And she ended up going to an NAACP meeting. NAACP meeting. That's it. NAACP meetings. Here, thank you for the correction.
Yep.
NAACP meeting, and while she's there, somebody said, "Oh, one of your biggest fans wants to talk to you." And she's like, "That's fine." And she turns around, and it's Martin Luther King, and he says, "I love Star Trek." And she said, "Well, Dr. King, I hate to tell you this, but I'm just about to leave the show." And he grabbed her by both hands, and he said, "You cannot." He said, "Don't you understand? This is the first show that shows a black person, specifically a black woman, who's not a maid, who's not in the background, but actually equal to everybody else in that you are an officer, and this is inspiring women all around you. So you cannot leave the show." And she said, and I looked at him and said, "Okay, I won't leave the show, Dr. King, because you don't say no to that." Right. And she's glad that she stayed. I mean, years later, when she couldn't get other jobs from working because she was so connected to Star Trek, she claimed that her father, used the old phrase of, make lemonade out of lemons. And she connected with NASA and became the NASA spokesperson to find new astronauts. Mm-hmm. And she did that for years. So she was actually quite upset when the Challenger exploded, because many of the people that were in the Challenger she had personally picked and selected to come and be part of NASA.
Wow.
So of course it continued. What happened was the show got canceled, and then found its new life in syndication and became a monster hit. And instantaneously, everybody talked about having it come back. The very first shuttle, you may not remember, the very first shuttle that wasn't fully operational but was used, they connected it to like a jumbo jet to show that its aerodynamics worked, was named the Enterprise for Star Trek.
Yes.
It was a write-in campaign, and everybody but William Shatner showed up, including Gene Roddenberry, showed up on the tarmac to christen it. So it had this real zeitgeist feel to it. All the characters were, very much like the Beatles, and I'm not just talking about Chekhov's hairstyle, which is the reason why he had that horrible rug, as he calls it. And he actually, for the first season, which was the second season, for the first season he was there, he had to wear this horrible wig that made him look like Davy Jones, because they wanted him to have that kind of connection with.
Because they wanted him to look like Davy Jones.
Exactly. The Russian Davy Jones. Walter Koenig is Davy Jones.
Let's take a break there then and look at, so why exactly then, Don, do you think Star Trek hit a chord with people at that time? Why do you think it was relevant then when it first came out?
Well, one of the things that Jack has hit on, there were a lot of firsts for the show. The show was really progressive, and Roddenberry wanted to kind of push that. That's why there was a lot of stuff when they did that original pilot that they got dinged for. I remember that number one, the second in command of the ship, they were specifically told that you can't have a woman in command of a ship. And in that first episode, the actual captain gets taken out by the aliens about 3 minutes in. She leads the attack on their base to get him back, and the network flipped because they said, and you especially can't show a woman leading a combat mission.
Yeah. No one would believe she's in charge of anything, is what they said, which was ridiculous.
Right.
So.
It is. But that was something, because Roddenberry's view was that in the future, none of that kind of thing would matter.
Yeah, which is quite reasonable.
Yeah.
And they also caught flack because of Mr. Spock, that the network accused him of being satanic looking.
Yep.
Yes. Well, wasn't his original makeup supposed to be more reddish? Wasn't the original plan
Yes.
that Spock was going to be a Martian, if I remember right?
Absolutely,
like that.
yes. You're absolutely right, yes.
And that's why they changed him green, I thought, or something like that.
No, I thought, because there's a story, too, that what kept happening is you'd see pictures of him that he looked red because they did him up green, but when they would run the camera tests and they would run the film checks, what was happening was the developers were changing the color palette, and he was coming back this weird orangey red because they thought the green was some kind of film error.
Yes, that I've heard that too. Yes.
Yep, I've heard that they were going crazy doing color correction on it.
Yeah, and same thing. The initial pictures, I can't remember the word. The not
promotional pictures, right?
Yeah, the promotional pictures. They airbrush it so he didn't have pointed ears.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And it's interesting because you think about that. These are all things that nowadays we wouldn't think twice about. But back then it was so weird to have a hero that was just that little bit different that nobody could wrap their head around it.
Right.
And then as the series went on, like famously again, Roddenberry always talked about, because it was science fiction, you could deal with social issues because people would say, oh, but that's like in space, so that's not the thing. And there were all kinds of like big morals and big issues they dealt with. And the thing that Trek did that nobody really did at the time, and that we kind of got away from, was the whole point of the story was, I guess you'd say, humanity. It was humanness.
Right.
Very few of the villains, quote unquote, were portrayed as evil. The situations weren't ones that you had to fight your way out of.
Right.
It was this idea that there would be a problem, and it was through application of, say, knowledge or patience or just like humanity, like kindness. There's an episode there's two. They went with comedy.
Yes, there is. Yeah.
Yep. And this was the ideas that were coming up. And when you started getting into the 60s, you started having hope, and you had people were looking at individuality as acceptable, that we didn't all have to be the 1950s Bob Dobbs type. This idea of
boomers wanted that, right?
Yeah. You had the idea of like inclusiveness, and that was something that in Star Trek, it didn't matter who you were, where you came from. Everybody, you could be like a weird alien dude, and you were treated just like everybody else.
Which probably appealed to the mood at the time.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
Makes sense.
And it's funny too to see that you can still see in that back and forth between what Roddenberry and a lot of the writers in that wanted to do and what the network wanted. Like the idea of introducing Chekhov was a big deal because this was the height of the Cold War, and them Ruskies were our enemies. And here's one on the bridge, and that's kind of a heavy thing to deal with. It's weird. It's not something you'd seen before, but the network wanted him to look like Davy Jones because they thought that would make teenage girls want to watch the show. That was their concern.
Right. They were more worried about that. Yeah, true.
And it's true that it didn't get it didn't really take off until when it came back in the early 70s, syndicated. And what's interesting because of that, one of the things that kept it going for the 3 years the original was on was they had these write-in campaigns from the fans.
Yeah.
And when the show was off the air, you had a lot of the fans would organize into fan groups and little conventions. And a lot of what we think of as a sci-fi fan, a sci-fi convention, it comes out of that Star Trek movement.
Right, yeah. Literally.
Yeah.
I mean, there were sci-fi conventions. I think we talked about this in one of our shows a long time ago. There were sci-fi conventions back in the 20s and 30s. But the modern convention, as we understand it, really starts with the Star Trek movement and the Star Trek convention.
Yeah.
That's definitely true. Now, I'm going to just play devil's advocate here and give a tiny bit of pushback, though. I think at that time, now I might be wrong about this, people can correct me or not, I'm not perfect about my 60s history because I wasn't born yet at this point, but I think Star Trek kind of came during a downturn in the whole sci-fi fandom. What I mean by that is, like sci-fi, like everything works in cycles, right? There are times when it's where it's popular in society, and times where it's not so popular. And there had been in the like late 50s, early 60s, maybe there was the sci-fi pulp boom and everything going on. So there was some sci-fi stuff in the late 50s, and that there were a ton of sci-fi shows. Tom Corbett, Space Cadet, and all those other shows. I mean, Scotty was even on one actually. He was a graduate of.
So was William Shatner.
Oh, that's right, he was, wasn't he? And and Leonard Nimoy was in a Republic serial, but that's neither here nor there.
Zombies from the upper stratosphere.
There we go. He was a bad guy, of course. 'Cause he's kind of weird. He's kind of funky looking. All right, but anyway, neither here nor there. But the thing is, I'm pretty sure that Star Trek actually came during a downturn in the whole sci-fi fandom thing. I think it actually wasn't that popular at that point when Star Trek actually came out. So my pushback would be, I think Star Trek may have actually been successful partly because it was one of the only sci-fi things out there. Like, I don't think it was a very crowded market at that point.
I think you're... Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, first of all, let's not forget that this happened when the moon landing happened, right? So that you had a huge resurgence in interest in space based upon that. So that would have made a big deal. But, I mean, they had Lost in Space. They had, didn't they have Land of the Giants at the same time? They did have a lot of different shows that had sort of...
That's true.
Kinda.
Yeah.
I think what happened was, I think, like, Rob is kind of half right.
Oh, thank you.
And I think Jack is picking up the other half, because you had a big sci-fi boom just prior to the original Trek pilot, and it was like all the Captain Video Space Ranger stuff, which was kind of considered kid stuff.
Actually, I should note that the actual moon landing didn't happen until '69, which was the year Star Trek went off the air, ironically enough.
But you had that was the zeitgeist. That was what everybody was talking about, outer space.
Okay.
And I think what ended up happening was Trek comes out and it really does borrow from all like the Space Ranger kind of stuff before it. But again, they wanted to mature it up, and I think that's where that was kind of the first time you were seeing that, and people didn't exactly know what to do with that. And then when you got towards the end of the 60s, you did have a sci-fi boom, and it kind of comes about because, number one, the psychedelia and different perspective and getting out of your head and all that is a big thing. And that's why you get like say, the Land of the Giants and that, which is a little more trippy than sci-fi from before. And you start getting into the apocalyptic science fiction.
Right.
And I think...
if I may interrupt, actually, it was pointed out, I'm trying to remember where I was reading about this, where people pointed out that actually a lot of the 50s sci-fi was actually very apocalyptic, or was very negative, actually.
Yeah, a lot. The novels and the stories.
And then stuff was very, like, amazing stories, and that was oddly negative, actually.
Yeah,
let's not forget Twilight Zone, too. The Twilight Zone had a huge impact upon that with that same kind of feel. Yeah,
and that's what kind of, I think, talking about the cycles, when you get to the end of the 60s, that combined with fears about, the Cold War and World War III is what leads to that cycle. And I think when you get into the 70s, one of the things that made Trek popular when it came back was, as I've seen it said, it was the only science fiction of that era that was saying that our best times were ahead.
That's true.
This is what I was going to say that I think, honestly, I think Star Trek probably created Solarpunk without knowing it.
Yeah, I can see that.
What do you mean?
Well, you know what Solarpunk is, right?
Review it for our audience.
Okay, so we have steampunk, which people are familiar with, 19th century science fiction. We have, the first punk, cyberpunk, which is based upon, connecting with the machine and that aspect. We have diesel punk, which is kind of like Rocketeer. What is it? My favorite. Sky Captain in the World of Submerged. No, as for new stuff, absolutely Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon are also diesel punk too. Right. But solar punk is a new sort of form for what they're saying. We don't have enough solar punk, which is a positive view of science fiction in the future. So like Tomorrowland, for example, would be solar punk. And Star Trek got people really, really excited about, the future isn't going to suck. It may suck in between time, but by the time we get to the 23rd century, we're going to have this racism, this gender issues. It's all going to be dealt with. People won't need money. We're just going to, we're going to be able to explore the universe and bring ourselves and the uniqueness of what humanity is among everywhere else. And that was really, really inspiring for a lot of people. It was one of the few science fiction shows, as far as I can tell, that really grasped women as much as it did men for that reason.
Okay, that's true. And a lot of the early writing campaign leaders were women. Yeah,
Yes.
that's true. I think the head of the writing campaign was a woman.
Absolutely. She was the first Star Trek, I forget her name now. She's got a very strange name, starts with a B. Bijou or something like that. Anyway, she started off the very first Star Trek fan club.
Right.
And there's stories about how Gene Roddenberry kind of fed her stuff. Like, yeah,
Right.
send the letters here, you know?
Right, yeah.
And make sure you do these here. So he was certainly involved in trying to, this is when they were first trying to cancel Star Trek. I think the first or second season, there was a push to try to cancel it. And he was doing his best to try to push back by saying, no, this is really well appreciated. And so they had massive letter writing campaigns.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So.
That is fair pushback. So there was a desire for science fiction in the air at that point when it came out, and it filled that niche. I can't help but wonder though if the fact that in '69 or so when it hit syndication was also the moon landing. So in a way, it tied in with that. Like it was suddenly everywhere because. That's the other thing, right? When it hit syndication, there wasn't a lot of syndicated content. That was one of the reasons why it was everywhere. People liked it. It was cheap. And
Okay, but you're missing a really important point.
What?
It was also good.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Like the quality was so much beyond. It was one of the first science fiction series that actually took science fiction seriously. And Ike Asimov said that very clearly. He was a huge fan, Isaac Asimov, as many others were, saying this is the only one that actually looks at science like that. Because you could take a look at the Swiss Family Robinson, and you could look at all those, Lost in Space and all those other things. And they were using them really as a very simple venture to try to tell adventure stories. They didn't care if the science gobbledygook meant something near and didn't mean something the next week. They didn't try to make sense of it in the same way as they did in Star Trek. And I think that once and the characters meant a lot. I mean, Karen Blair wrote a book about she was a famous psychologist. Wrote a book about the three different roles of Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, all representing the perfect man. McCoy being the man of the past, Spock being the man of the future, and Kirk being the man of the present, being able to utilize both actions. The past being somebody who's always involved in, like, emotionally invested and flying off the handle at times, but still emotionally connected. And the man of the future, Spock, of course, being logically motivated. And logically and functioning in that way, but also maybe being a little less connected to humanity. And Kirk recognizing when had to be in play at both times by being the captain. And she wrote a whole book on this. So there was something there for people to be able to build upon.
Okay, fair enough. There was something. There was a high quality show for them to work from, and I think even the model work that they were doing at that time for this show was actually fantastic. The effects they were doing for TV budget were amazing.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yep. Okay, I will agree with that.
Each episode cost $100,000 during the day to make,
and that's a lot of money.
That's a huge budget, and we don't think about that now. But just as I remember when Battlestar Galactica came out as a television series, and they reused a lot of their footage. They didn't have, brand new fight scenes all the time or any of that stuff. Yeah. They cost $1 million to make, and that was back in the 80s.
Yep. They would have. And that was also one of the things that got it canceled by the end of its first season.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
Well, and as I recall, that was the original Star Trek's problem too. Was it wasn't pulling in the ratings for The Expanse.
Yeah, I could definitely see that.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so we better get moving on because otherwise we're going to spend just the whole episode just on the original Trek. But the original Trek is important; it's foundational. So so we go from there. All right, so Jack, since you're our Trek historian for this little voyage, why don't you take us through what happens next?
So it was one of those mismatches. We started off with a lot of people sort of writing their own fan fiction. We see fan fiction books popping up. Trek, the New Voyages of Star Trek was one collection of professional fan fiction that came in, and New Voyages 2 came in as well. I think they were done by Sandra Marshak. This is just from my memory, so I'm not sure. But if I remember correctly, she was one of the secretaries in the show and had really gotten involved in writing and producing and connecting. So suddenly we saw a series of books, 12, I believe, that sort of had a fictional version of all the episodes. And then we saw more people interested, and the talk began about how do we possibly bring this show back. The first time they tried to bring it back was in the 70s through an animation series, which was really badly done. But most animation series back then were. At least the stories, for the most part, there were some sillier ones, but for the most part, they did try to bring back some of their big writers. That's the other thing, is a lot of science fiction writers wrote for the original Star Trek. Theodore Sturgeon, Samuel Peoples. I mean, and let's not forget, everybody forgets the lost Gene. Gene L. Kuhn was one of the great writers in Star Trek, and he's not really well respected. And unfortunately, many of the things that he came up with, Gene Roddenberry claims that he created, and that's not cool. For example, he came up with a lot of the military aspects that they used, as well as Gene Roddenberry to a certain degree, but the Klingons and the Organian Peace Treaty and all those main functions of Star Trek, they were all from Gene L. Kuhn. And he was like an incredibly fast writer. I believe he actually left the show and created the Munsters after that, which is kind of funny. But he was famous for doing a number of different shows. So
pretty sure the Munsters predate Star Trek, actually, Jack. You have it backwards.
No, okay. You've checked that, have you?
Well, remember, we did the whole horror host thing a while back.
Yep.
The Munsters was 64 to 66. So
okay, so
predate. It's the way.
Maybe he got hired away from the Munsters.
Yeah, he might have actually.
That's quite possible. I know that he was involved, and I thought he created it. Maybe he did leave the show at one point. I could have that completely mixed up. Thank you for correcting that. So no problem. So one of the interesting stories is that when they got the animation, they weren't going to hire any of the ancillary actors. They weren't going to hire George Takei. They weren't going to hire Walter Koenig. They weren't going to hire Nichelle. They might have hired Nichelle, but Leonard Nimoy said he wouldn't sign on unless everybody was signed on.
Yep, that's true.
So he held them back, and they've said many times, we will always remember Leonard for that he didn't have to, but he felt that it was really important to the show and the integrity of the show to do that. So then there was the big story about Phase 2. Phase 2 was going to be coming. Mind you, they had great series of comics too. I was remembering a bunch of comics that I had gotten, which were
Key ones?
The gold key ones, yes.
Yeah.
I have the collection. I have collections 1, 2, and 3. I didn't realize there was a fourth collection. And they were drawn by this guy from Italy who basically never seen Star Trek before.
And it shows.
It does. I mean, the Enterprise nacelles look like rocket blasters. They just, and the first whole comic doesn't even have communicators. They have like a radio kind of thing, which they use. And, it's very, very weird, the stories that come from that, but it was kind of fun. So then like Phase 2 was going to be on television, and everybody was excited about that. They had everybody signed except for Leonard Nimoy completely. He was upset about a particular billboard. I'm sure you've heard that story.
I don't remember it. Refresh our memory.
Well, William Shatner tells it best in a university lecture series that he has that I basically memorized when I was in high school. I got the cassette and listened to it over and over and over again. And William Shatner would go around to universities in between this place and just do a live performance because he couldn't get any work. So he remembers telling about he used to go with a truck, and the truck would have on the back of it sort of just like a little mobile home kind of thing that he could get off the truck, and it would come up. And he said that he didn't realize what that little mobile home looked like until he heard a rapping on the door, and there was a little like 8-year-old kid who said, "Are you Captain Kirk?" and of course he said yes. And is this your spaceship? And he said, sure enough, this thing looked like a spaceship because it had like pods that came out and everything like that.
Right.
And so William Shatner said, yes. And the kid said,
Of course.
"Where do you beam down?" And so he said, "I showed him the shower." And so he would go around and do from show to show to show. And I guess he was relaying the story of Leonard Nimoy was away, I believe, in England or Germany, off, and he saw this 3-cornered billboard as they used to move, and they would change and morph into 3 different things. And he looked up, and he said, Leonard with the ears, but the ears were drooping.
Mm-hmm.
Like sad drooping Spock. And the second billboard that turned was sad droopy-eared Spock and a tankard of ale. And then the third one was tankard of ale gone, droopy-eared Spock's ears shot straight up. And so Leonard thought, this is kind of demeaning. And he sort of realized that he wasn't being paid a dime for them using his likeness, because back in the day they didn't, right? That's one of the reasons why we got them for so many years coming to fan conventions, because they made no residuals off of one of the great shows that had been in, what's the word? In
syndication.
Syndication, thank you. In syndication for decades. They didn't make a dime off of it. Oh, exactly. Ridiculously cheap. So anyway, he started fighting with the network about it. They wanted him in Star Trek. According to William Shatner on the show, he wanted to do it, but he had to be able to do that. So they created another character, which ended up being used in the original Star Trek movie, and killed off.
Killed off because they'd already started production, and then Leonard Nimoy settled with them and decided to come back.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I thought they had him in the script that he was going to die in a transporter accident, but I wasn't sure. Anyway, so they wanted him.
I always heard. Because that's why they hired the guy. They had him in there, so they thought, okay, we'll just use him anyway. We'll have the transporter accident.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah.
I do know that they were hoping that he and the guy who played Will Decker would actually take over for William Shatner if William Shatner didn't want to continue with the series for very long too. And Will Decker was going to be the number one then. So they had all this kind of planned, and they were going to do it as a series. And they even did some shooting of the show. And then this thing called Star Wars showed up, and they went, wait. We're not going to do a television series anymore. We're going to do a movie.
Okay, hold on a sec. You're actually missing a small part, because actually I find Star Trek Phase 2 fascinating. So there's actually another part to it.
Okay.
Paramount was actually looking to set up a 4th network during the 70s. Okay. And they decided, since it was so darn popular, they were going to get a Star Trek series to be their pilot for their 4th network. Or one of them. And so that's why they created Star Trek Phase 2. That's why it was planned. I think almost a whole season's worth of episodes were written, or at least planned out. I don't know if they wrote the full scripts or not, but they did plan them out. And they wrote some of them anyway. We know that because some of them got used for Next Gen. But we'll get to that in a minute. And so, so they had all this stuff was going on. Then actually the whole TV plan fell apart. The network plan fell apart. So suddenly the funding wasn't there anymore for this Star Trek thing. So Phase 2 really just wasn't going to happen. But they'd already, as you said, sunk the money into it. They'd already had some sets. They already had some stuff. And then Star Wars came out, and they thought, well, why don't we just make it into a movie?
Oh, okay. See, I didn't hear that part, and that's surprising. I did not know that.
Go read the history of Phase 2. And so that's basically what happened. Is that
I've got the book on Phase 2. Have you got that?
I read it years ago. I don't have it anymore, but I did have it.
Yeah.
But anyway, the whole Paramount Network thing is an important thing because it'll come back later on. Actually, twice, in fact.
Yes.
But we'll get to that in a minute. Anyway, so the point is also there's a story that goes that I don't know if this part is true or if it's apocryphal, that they were planning to do this Phase 2 Star Trek movie, and then they actually went and saw Star Wars, and then Gene came back and said, we're going to need a bigger budget. And that's part of the reason why they basically turned Star Trek the Motion Picture into Star Trek the Motionless Picture, as some people call it, because it's of these big sweeping effects scenes. It's because they were trying to out special effects Star Wars.
Walter Koenig calls it that, too.
Yeah.
They had a really, really popular director do it, but he didn't really understand Star Trek either. Was it James Whitmore who was the director? I can't remember.
Or was it Robert Wise?
No, it was Robert Wise. That's right. James Whitmore Jr. Came out and did later Star Treks and did a very good job. I should say that. Yeah, it was Robert Wise who did it.
Yeah, Robert Wise. Yes, it was. Yeah,
you're right. Absolutely right. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And so that they thought it was dead then, because the movie was it really wasn't a very interesting movie to watch. I mean, I remember watching the DVD extras were like the movie with another 40 minutes of Spock flying around.
Yeah.
It was terrible. Well, part of it was Spock flying around, part of it was Voyager, which was again just as emotionlessly boring. Yeah. But people still came. They came in droves. My dad took me. I remember it was like one of the few times my dad actually took me to a movie theater, just him and I. It might be the only time my dad took me to a movie theater, just him and I, was to see Star Trek: The Motion Picture together. Wow. So that so a lot of kids were like that. And if you go watch, what was it called? It's a great indie movie. Free Enterprise. Have you seen that movie?
Yeah.
And it's based on you have to watch it. It's based on the true story of these two guys who are big Star Trek nerds. And it starts off with them like when they're kids, and they're trying to get in to see Star Trek: The Motion Picture, but they're too young. And so they can't be in. Like the one guy is, and he's too young and he can't be in. The other guy, his memory is being beaten up by a bully in a gold shirt. And then fighting back and having the shirt ripped just like Kirk, and then giving the whole "no, I won't hurt him anymore." The whole Gorn speech to the kids, right? It was, it's a hilarious show, very well done, lots of fun. They meet William Shatner, and he's reading porn in a bookstore. So they got William Shatner to play a part. The kid gets knocked out at one point, and William Shatner shows up in his dream. And he goes, "I can't believe you're here." And he goes, "Are you kidding? I'm like the number one hero for kids to dream about when they're knocked unconscious," or something like that. And he goes, "Why did you get in this fight anyway? Like, don't you realize that fighting's no good?" And the kid goes, "Well, he said that Han Solo could kick Captain Kirk's ass, or could beat up Captain Kirk." And he looks at the kid and goes, "Kick his ass." And that's when he comes out of the stupor and starts beating him up. It's hilarious. It's a great show.
Get back out there. Yeah. Exactly. Okay. No, that's pretty good.
Yeah.
Because it's one of the things I found later on, because the first Star Trek movie, it's really just Nomad again.
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
Absolutely.
I found it.
Is, yeah.
Even as like an 8-year-old, I knew that, but it's interesting in hindsight because the movie, in a lot of ways, is a fictionalized representation of the whole Star Trek Phase 2 thing.
Right.
Because the whole point that Kirk comes in and takes over from Decker, and Decker's pissed off. As I recall, he was supposed to be the captain on the new ship when they were first coming up with the idea.
I don't know about that part.
Because I'd heard that was one of the things they wanted. He was going to be the next big star because they were kind of feeling Shatner was getting old. And then when Shatner agreed to do the film and that, Kirk again becomes the focus of it. And then Shatner
was going to be part of Star Trek Phase 2. He was going to be on the TV show. But that's not quite it. What happened is that the reason they had Decker there was Shatner, they were pretty sure, was only going to be there for maybe the first season of the TV show.
Right.
He was basically a fallback if Shatner didn't want to come back for a second season.
Yeah.
So
or ask for too much money, right? They wanted to keep the cost down. Yeah.
Exactly. So he was basically what's the theatrical term? Not stand-in.
Understudy.
Understudy. He's basically Shatner's understudy is what it amounts to. That's why the whole character of Decker is there. Yeah, he's there to take over if Shatner doesn't want to continue.
Which is kind of what
that's why they have effectively two captains on the ship.
And they created another character, Aaliyah, right? The Delta, which I thought was a cool character. Why she didn't come back, I don't know.
Well, because she's like an android now moving on through like the solar system at light speed.
Oh, that's right, man. It's been so long since I've seen the movie. You're absolutely right. That's what happened. Yeah, she got vaporized, and then they replaced her. That's right. I forgot about that. Well, and poor Persis Kambatra, the lady who was this Miss India who played her, she just died a couple years ago.
Huh.
Yes, she did.
Yeah, so that's too
People
bad.
tend to do that.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, but yeah, no, that's true. Although, again, we technically do see Aaliyah again. She's just called Deanna Troi when we get to Star Trek: The Next Generation.
Exactly.
Yeah,
it's a new version of Aaliyah. Yeah.
Because the truth is, Next Gen is basically Star Trek Phase 2. If you look at it, it basically followed the Star Trek Phase 2 structure.
Not only that, Rob, they actually redid some of the scripts for it.
Yeah,
they used Phase 2 scripts for some of the Star Trek Next Generation.
As I mentioned, but there was a catch to that. That's because they were having a writer's strike during Star Trek: The Next Generation.
Yes.
And they needed a bunch of scripts really, really fast. So look, we've got all these Phase 2 scripts. Let's just rewrite them for Next Gen.
That's right. Yeah.
Unfortunately, anyway, but they didn't use some of the better ones though. But that's okay. That's neither here nor there.
Yeah, we're not up to Next Generation yet, but we are getting there.
Let's do that.
Yeah.
So then the next thing that happens is they start, because that was really popular. We're also seeing, by the way, a lot of audiobooks, which I own a ton of, that are starting to come out because they're made from a series of Star Trek novels, which are extremely popular to begin with.
Yeah.
I think I own 67 in succession, the very first 67 of those. And I have a bunch of others too, but I have a huge Trek wall of books. So, but and the thing is, like, I would say my favorite was actually James Doohan. He did amazing intonations for Kirk, Spock, and McCoy. He was a great mimic. He really did had a good ear for it. George Takei did a great job as well. Leonard Nimoy did some of them as well. But those were basically the three actors they got to just redo these kind of stories as an audiobook, and it was kind of exciting. So then we forward ahead. They thought, okay, we got enough money to try another one. Let's pull a different director in and try to make it a little more Hollywood, big budget. And that's where they got probably the best made Star Trek movie of all time, which certainly echoes the same kind of storyline from then on, and that's The Wrath of Khan. And Nicholas Meyer, who had not seen Star Trek before, was hired to do this and went home and watched a whole bunch of old Star Trek movies and was enamored with Space Seed and Ricardo Montalban as Khan Noonien Singh. Yeah. And so he decided, let's bring back Khan. And it was a blockbuster. It was huge. Everybody loved it. Everybody quoted it. And continued.
Everybody still does,
Still does. Khan! Yes. So, it was a great show, and it sort of set them off. And now Harv Bennett was also involved in Star Trek II as one of the executive producers, and he became known as basically the executive producer for 3 or 4 movies after that. It was somewhere between 2 and 3 or 3 and 4 that Next Generation started.
Next Generation starts in 87.
Yeah.
So by that point, let's see.
Just after the third?
In Next Generation, okay, we've just had the Voyage Home, the fourth.
Oh, the fourth one. Okay, that's further on. So the thing is, by the way, Gene Roddenberry was kind of shut out at this point from the Hollywood movies, and he wasn't happy. He had a script that he'd been trying to foist on people for a long time, which was basically they tried to stop Kennedy from being shot, which isn't very interesting for most of the world. It might be interesting for Americans, but really it doesn't make that much of a difference. And they kind of did something similar, much better, in the original one with Edith Keeler, right? Way back. And that was written by a very famous science fiction writer at the time as well.
Harlan Ellison.
Harlan Ellison, thank you very much. Who, by the way, won the Emmy for writing of that, and was one of the first ones that write it. And I guess there's a beautiful story that comes from that book I told you about, Inside Star Trek, where he actually comes up. They're all sitting by the table, and he lifts up the Emmy and looks at them and says, "Never let the bastards rewrite you." And everybody looked at the Star Trek table, and Gene Roddenberry smiles and says, "Oh, what the fuck are you gonna do?" Kind of thing. He just laughed about the whole thing because he's like, we got an Emmy. It helps us no matter what. But Harlan is known as the angry man of science fiction.
Yes,
so
he is.
I spent a. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, but his script is horribly written by because his original script, if you've ever seen it, is very different than City on the Edge of Forever.
Absolutely, it literally, he says never let them edit you, but they totally did. And the thing was, it was completely unusable for a television script. Yeah. It was too expensive, too long, and it just didn't deal it. They said it was brilliant. I've never seen it, to be honest. But it was the rewrites, and much of that was Gene Roddenberry, when I think he actually was writing at one of the top of his game when he was writing the original Star Trek. I think he kind of drank, some of his Kool-Aid by the time Next Generation came around, and he'd been so hurt. He really listened to what the listeners wanted, or what the viewers wanted, and they liked, the whole aspect of Star Trek being a new place where people could work together and there was no more conflict, and he took that to heart. And so when they came up with Next Generation, it was a rule that lasted like a plague on Star Trek for many generations afterwards, that they couldn't have conflict between the main characters. And that was part of what really drove what made Star Trek amazing, was Kirk and Spock, or rather Spock and McCoy, could fight pretty vociferously about something and make a point about that and still be able to be professional. And one of the things I actually didn't like about Next Generation was they didn't do that. They didn't have real conflict. One of the few times they had conflict was in the second season when they brought in a new doctor, Dr. Pulaski. I loved her because she was just really against them. I remember she was, she says, so what's your name to the robot? And he says, Data. And she goes, okay, so Data. And he says, no, Data. And she goes, well, what's the difference? You're a robot, And it was great because he just pushed back upon all the touchy-feely stuff that was going on. But true to form, the Star Trek viewers did not like her, and she was gone at the end of that season. And the original Dr. Crusher came back in for that.
There's some weirdness that happens at the beginning of the Next Generation. And a lot of it comes from Roddenberry. And I think what it is, because it's the same reason why, if you remember when they brought back E.T. for DVD, they had to edit it because, oh my God, it was too horrifying. And it's that idea, when you get old, when you have a family, when you're getting established, your perspectives change. So like Roddenberry back in the 60s was like standing by his guns, and he was pushing this weird kind of show nobody ever heard of. But then by the time of the Next Gen, he's settled, he's getting older, he's mellowing out kind of thing. Like you're not as angry at the world when you're like a bajillionaire. It's kind of hard to maintain that.
That's true. And
what ends up happening is there's a lot of things that come out of Trek, at least for the beginning of like the Next Gen, because that was the FASA role-playing game ended up kind of getting canned because they had things coming down that that Paramount and Roddenberry didn't like the more military aspects of the game. And this was a big part of Trek from the beginning because they're basically the Space Navy. Like, they are the military.
Yeah, Nicholas Meyer brought that back, and people loved it, right? Because he liked, was it Sea Hunt and stuff like that, and said this is really what Star Trek is from Nicholas Meyer's perspective. It's a military story with best friends and the idea of male friendship. Can I just do a little insert about this? Because this really gets my butt. Okay. I know I swore already earlier. You can bleep that out if you want. But
he said, "But."
I said, "But."
What the fuck is wrong with you, Jack?
I know so many people, and it's especially like I've had girlfriends who make fun of the fact that Kirk and Spock are friends, and suggest that it's homosexual relationship between the two of them, which I mean is not a big deal if that were the case. But this isn't the case, and this there seemed to be a big push for, and I think it continues to be this way, to try to sort of sexualize male friendships in such a way as to say there really isn't such a thing as this male bonding brotherhood kind of thing, that really underneath it all, it's just, sexual desires. And it really kind of bothered me when I heard it, because one of the things I loved growing up in Star Trek was, you could have male friends that you could trust and that would be there for you when you needed them, and you could be there for them when you did. That idea of brotherhood was a really powerful motivator for me. And I felt that there was a whole generation that, and I mean, slash fiction started with this Kirk and Spock in this passionate embrace. That's where that kind of fiction began. It was Kirk and Spock originally. And I'm not against people doing their slash fiction of anything, but I think we should also sit there and say, to be honest, what is wrong with that depiction of male friends? Why do people find that threatening? Why do people find that suspicious? We have no problem with women being friends, but there's a real push against that for men, and it always kind of bothered me, and it stuck in my craw because I really saw it differently growing up. I can see that. Any points on that?
Yeah, I think what ends up happening is with things like that, people don't realize how much of their perception is based on their time.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of, and this is why it's funny if you go back to, say, the 50s and that, a lot of what we consider macho at one point becomes overblown at another point. It becomes like creepy at another point, depending on what the current, I don't even want to say attitude, just the current symbols, the current window dressing that
Zeitgeist.
we use. Yeah, I guess that's probably the best word. And the thing with like a lot of the Trek, especially your first series, it comes more out of that 50s, early 60s kind of like macho sportsman kind of thing, where like a guy can slap another guy on the back and like you work out and just like with no shirt and stuff, and nobody thought anything of it because that was just how it worked. And then that imagery changes later on because you get a little more, get like an era that's a little more uptight, like the 80s where social mores started getting ratcheted up. People get a little more uptight about that, and seeing dudes who are that like free with the physical contact and that takes on a different connotation.
True.
Fair enough. And I want to point out now that I'm on the Gene Roddenberry IMDb page.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And most movies that he's associated with are Star Trek porn movies. Because they're based on characters he created, right? So they have to show them on the IMDb page. And there's like 10 of them. There's probably more of those than there are original Star Trek movies that he's made. So there's something in the zeitgeist for that as well. People want to be able to utilize. Now, I'm not talking about necessarily, the Spock Kirk relationship. There's a whole bunch of other straight porn there as well. But it's interesting that once you get something popular, there's going to be porn made out of it.
Well, that's Rule 34, sir. That's Rule 34.
Well, and then that's another thing we've talked about before too. Is it ties into that same idea that what you get out of things and your expectations and that change as you do. So this is one of the reasons why you get like, especially say nowadays, you'll get weird, creepy Rule 34 versions of like kid stuff, because things you liked as a kid, when you get older, you still carry that affection for them, but then the hormones kick in, and then you start asking yourself all kinds of weird things, like, if there are male and female Care Bears, do they do it? and it's because, again, like age appropriateness works both ways. So an adult mind looking at kids' things is looking for stuff that a kid's mind would never think, and then you start filling them in, and that's how Rule 34 happens.
Right.
That makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense, unfortunately. Yeah, that's the way it works. And back to what you said, Jack, actually, I mean, I think in some ways I've always, I hadn't really thought too much about it, but I think Star Trek did alter my view, or I wouldn't say alter, add to my view of male friendships and that. Like to me, when I was growing up, I mean, Kirk and Spock, best buds and all that, that is an archetype, a male friendship archetype that I looked at and said, yeah, I want friends like that. I want to know people and have that kind of relationship with guys.
Sure, absolutely. So that was a bit of a side. I appreciate you you allowing me to indulging me. Thank you for that.
No, it's a perfectly reasonable criticism.
Well,
yeah,
actually, I think it ties in really well, because if you look at the Next Generation, even though they're supposed to be friends, like, I didn't care for the Next Gen, and part of it was because all the characters were so, like, noble and upstanding and like, intelligent. You just wanted to slap all of them. But if you look, even the guys that are friends, there's still this weird distance between them.
Yes.
Like, and I think again, it's because that was the era. The 80s were more uptight. And the interesting thing of Next Generation is you had the android guy who didn't have feelings and didn't understand emotion, who wanted to. And I think in some ways that goes with like what you guys were saying, especially what Rob was saying. Data was the guy who wanted the Kirk Spock relationship. He wanted that close friendship, but because he was a product of his environment, he didn't exactly know how to go about doing that. And I think it's funny because that seems to kind of tie in with that whole kind of point we're just getting at.
That's true. It fits. We might as well just fast forward. I mean, so
well, I think
it was a big hit, and then we had two other movies.
Well, no, I wanted to point out this. I know we're going to fast forward. I think 2, 3, and 4 is the only legitimate trilogy in the Star Trek series.
I would agree with that.
Yeah,
because you begin with the Wrath of Khan, where you begin with the death of Spock, and you end with the voyage home with literally Spock not just being reborn but finding himself again. So, and I wrote a bit of an article on this on Jack J. Ward's site about Rogue One, and I referenced them and why Rogue One works extremely well as the only effective Star Trek episode or movie you can have that will last the test of time in that way as something great. Star Wars, yeah. Rogue One and Star Wars. Did I say Star Trek?
Yeah.
I said Star Trek.
Oh wow, so Star Wars. But
I don't want you to be hunted down and strung up.
Yeah, that would be a big bad thing. Words. I love them both, but not equally. Anyway, so the thing about it is that Star Wars is a mythic tale. It's Lord of the Rings, and Star Trek is pulp action in a big universe. So you can keep telling these different stories. That's the upshot of it is. And there's only really one long form story in Star Trek, and it's in 2, 3, and 4.
Yeah,
right. That's true.
That works.
I hadn't thought about that, but you're right. I would agree.
Yeah.
And the movies were very popular. I remember when the fourth one came out, like everyone went to see it. It was even people who were non-Trek fans went to see it because it was just so popular at that point.
Well, I think it also had a lot of in for people because it wasn't in space as much as it was on Earth in a regular time. So it was a date night kind of movie that you could actually take because it was so full of humor. And it was just it was a very easy in for people for that. It also was the second opportunity for Leonard Nimoy to be the director. After Star Trek II was so popular, Leonard Nimoy only allowed himself, they only got him in if he could die off. And then when he died off, he's like, I don't want to kill off Spock. So he got back in as a director to start doing that. So he directed 3, then he directed 4. And then we had the embarrassing situation where whatever was in his contract also William Shatner had to have in his contract. So Shatner was the director of Star Trek V. Probably, with the exception of one, the worst of the Star Trek original series movies, in my opinion. I have a friend of mine who thinks it's brilliant, and I think everything he thinks is crap. So that's fine. He has terrible taste. Yeah. The 5, The Final Frontier, now Shatner claims that it was plagued with all sorts of budgetary constraints that would have fixed the problem. I think that whenever you're trying to find God, it's ultimately going to be defeating.
Yeah, pretty much.
Because you can never truly find God because Well, it doesn't make any sense as a story to be able to facilitate that. But then when they knew that they had a misstep, they brought back Nick Meyer for one of my favorites as well, and that's The Undiscovered Country. And they went back to the roots of saying, what kind of story can we tell that fits in with the zeitgeist of the time or the history and the political aspects of the time? And they told a story about Russia versus the United States in a Cold War situation, and using the backdrop of the Klingons being the failing Russian empire, and possibly being able to come together after all of these difficulties and finding a new way to forge together as friends. So it was a really powerful show, and that was going to be the end.
Yeah.
Now, according to George Takei, they loved watching, Walter Koenig and him loved watching Star Trek The Next Generation because it was so bad. But then it got better. And then they got really worried. As long as it was bad, their phones would always be ringing, right?
Yeah.
But somewhere around season 2 and 3, they started getting a better idea of what to do with Star Trek Next Generation. And that's when Next Generation took over the movies. Now,
well, okay, so let's go back then. Since we're now, because you've jumped past it, so let's go back. So so 87 comes around, which is also around the time that let's see, Voyage Home comes out in 86. Star Trek is in the air. Paramount at this point, first run syndication is suddenly a thing in the mid to late 80s.
Yeah,
where suddenly they discover, we can just make programs for syndication. If I remember right, it also has to do with there were some changes in the U.S. rules about syndication and such that allowed for this to happen around that time. And so, end result, Paramount says, well, we're gonna start producing first-run syndication. What should we do? Well, let's do Star Trek. Thus, Star Trek: The Next Generation is born. So they go to Roddenberry and say, well, you want to do your new Star Trek series? And he says, hell yes. And as an end result, he basically, as we've said earlier, resurrects a lot of what was supposed to be Star Trek Phase 2, mixes around, gets this older British actor named Patrick Stewart, who no one has heard of but seems okay, to come in, gets a crew of effective nobodies, because let's face it, they are, because so they know they can get them all for cheap.
Well, wait a minute, Patrick Stewart was in Dune beforehand, so he was known as a theater actor at one point.
I'm actually being somewhat sarcastic. Well, actually, he wasn't known in the States.
No, you're right.
He was a British theater actor who'd been in Dune, which was a huge failure.
Yeah.
Yes.
And was maybe in one or two other projects. I'd have to go look up his IMDb. But was effectively, he was unknown back then, though. Outside of England.
For sure.
He was known in England. But outside the UK, he was a nobody.
For sure.
And so
the big star was Brent.
On that.
Yeah, Brent Spiner was the big star when they started it.
Yeah, he was the most known star in that program, I'd say.
Because he had a recurring role on Night Court.
Although I think LeVar Burton had already
he would
wrong.
be.
LeVar Burton was.
Yeah, he was the big name.
because of Roots. Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
And Reading Rainbow.
He was the star of Roots, if I remember right.
That's right. Yeah.
And Reading Rainbow.
And also Reading Rainbow as well. So actually, the biggest star in that cast was actually LeVar Burton.
Yes. Now, Gates McFadden, I believe, had some turns in some soap operas. But what I didn't realize was she was very famous behind the scenes. She had done a lot of work on movies. I'm trying to remember if it was Legend or if it was Jim Henson's fantasy epic.
The Dark Crystal?
The Dark Crystal. I think she's done work on The Dark Crystal. I think she was doing costuming and makeup for those. So it's something to look into, but I just learned those recently.
She was a dancer. That's what
she was as well. She was as well. She was a very talented person, apparently, or probably still is.
Oh, yeah.
She's still around.
Yeah, she's still around, so I hope she is. I mean, if I remember right, Marina Sirtis had also had a bit of a rep, but over in the UK. She was another UK actor.
That's right.
You can actually see her in an episode of Jeremy Brett's Sherlock Holmes.
Yes. Which I missed. He died early, way too early, Jeremy Brett. He was a great one. Now we got to point out something here. There was a time where Gene Roddenberry was running as far and as fast as he could away from Star Trek. He was tired of being known as the guy who could only do one-hit wonders Star Trek. He was trying to throw everything at the wall, which is why we got in the 80s. We had other shows that he did.
Yep.
That
Mhm.
like
Do a
that
couple
he like
pilots.
he
and
did
70s too.
in
Yeah.
70s. But I mean 80s ones that stuck. Like Andromeda was one of his
Yeah.
originally, and there was
it was meant to be. Well, he planned it. Andromeda never aired.
Not while he was alive.
not while he was alive. No, but I'm just saying. Yeah, I'm just saying after he planned it in the 80s, but they came afterwards. What was the other one that was really big too?
There was like Arc 2, wasn't it? Because he did this weird thing where he had two pilots that are basically exactly the same.
Yes.
This is why there's a character named Dylan Hunt, which is the name of the character in Andromeda, also pops up in like one or two other of his projects because he basically kept doing the same project over and over again.
No, there was another one, and I can't remember what it was called, but it was about like aliens coming to Earth. And it was like this time in Earth or whatever.
Oh, I thought you talked about Earth's Final Conflict.
That's it.
Oh,
Earth's Final Conflict. That was
but again,
that was a hit
that's
for
a 90s
while.
series.
No, I'm just saying he had planned all these things, and what happened was after he died in '91, I think Majel Barrett took over, and she started helming these things and driving them through and making them come to television.
Yep.
And it's almost like he couldn't sell stuff fast enough. Everything was another Gene Roddenberry project.
Well, keep in mind at that point, okay, there's that small catch. Okay, so Next Gen comes out. It has its first season, and for most people, it's a joke. I mean, I remember in high school talking to other classmates, and and I remember this one girl who was a huge Trek fan that I knew, and she's like, "It's so bad. How can people watch this show? It's so bad." Everyone kept watching it, even though it was quote unquote so bad.
Right.
But the truth is, most people were not impressed.
Yeah.
No.
And first season, Next Gen, I actually have a soft spot for it because even though the acting is very wooden and it has a lot of issues, it also feels really big. I even wrote a blog post about this ages ago, where there are a lot of weird things they're trying, and they're trying really hard to do something different, and so they try all these different types of stories, and so as an end result, it actually feels like you're going into someplace new. It really does feel like new material, and there's a whole new universe here that we're getting ready to explore, and we kind of do in a way too. But then by second season, if I recall right, they had started to push Gene out. I think he was already on his way out by second season. Yeah. And at this point, the new showrunners, who I'm blanking on,
Rick Berman.
Rick Berman
and Braga,
Michael,
wasn't it?
Yeah, Brennan Braga, I think.
Yeah.
Rick Berman, who was Rick Berman was Roddenberry's partner starting from 89, which is the second year, so second season. Rick Berman was brought in basically to run the show, pretty much, or to help run it anyway. Yeah. And Maurice Hurley for 88, 89 as well.
Yeah.
And they start making changes to make it a little more of an adventure series, a little more standard. I would argue that some of the magic actually disappears in second season. Now, does the acting get better? Do some of the scripts get better? Yes, they do. But I would argue that it's not quite as... It's more... How can I put this? It feels a little more inward focuses. Like in starting the second season, it starts to feel a little more like a drama that's actually focused on itself rather than about the universe around it.
It was. There was a lot more wonder in the first season. Yeah, for sure, and that's
they
true.
Were focused on that.
Yes,
and we're by second season, partly for budget reasons, I suspect. I've heard that by second season, they were basically told you've got one alien rubber suit and one new set, and that's it. That's all you can have per episode. That's what I'd always heard. I don't know if it's true or not, but because they were just, they had to get it in on the at least budget. I don't know if its budget got cut by second season, but it was they were limited in what they could do. So that's again part of the reason why it's a little more inward focused by second season. But again, the actors are starting to get into the roles. People are starting to see, okay, this is how it works. I mean, they brought in some good writers. For better or for worse, Roddenberry's out at this point, or a little more out. And then, of course,
and writers that we now would say are incredible writers, like I think people like Ron Moore and Brannon Braga, people who've written science fiction and stuff like that for a long time. Who's one of my favorites? I forget his name now. But he's brilliant, and they brought him in for Enterprise as well. He's just a really good writer, and he wrote some of the best Star Trek Next Generation episodes too. Mm-hmm. So yeah, they started to go back to the roots of what they knew would really sell an adventure story, not just a Star Trek story.
Exactly, and it paid off. I mean, by the end of second season, I believe it is where they have their first encounter with the Borg. I think it's or maybe that's the end of third season.
I think it's third. I think Borg were third.
I think you're right. I think I'm mistaking it. Best of Both Worlds was end of third. Okay, so third season, the ratings started to go up. Third season happened, and they finished. By the end of third season, they did Best of Both Worlds.
Yeah.
And at that point, people were Star Trek nuts.
Yeah.
I mean, it was the show that you watched.
Yeah.
Patrick Stewart was literally declared like the sexiest man on television.
Yes.
And it was winning awards left, right, and center.
Yep.
And it was a major cultural event when, holy shit, Picard has been turned into a Borg. He's going to kill the rest. He's going to kill the Enterprise.
Yep.
What's going to happen next?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And people were nuts at that point. For
and
Star
they
Trek
took
and
honestly, I really like the fact, like, to me, that Best of Both Worlds was a great episode. That was really, but I liked the episode afterwards, Family, which was all about the aftermath of it. To me, that was a beautiful little piece, which was very little Star Trek influence. It was literally Jean-Luc Picard going home and dealing with the trauma of it all. And you didn't see that a lot in Star Trek.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what bothered me. It's one of the reasons why I love Babylon 5 so much more, is that they dealt with that. They dealt with the trauma of the characters, and they made it part of the plot points. And I will always rail against this, but, they had an episode where Geordi LaForge gets brainwashed by the Romulans.
Uh-huh.
Mm-hmm.
And they ended off the episode with him going to talk to Counselor Troy and saying, okay, so tell me about it. And it's never mentioned again for the entire run of the series, the entire run of the movies. It's like, that was a pretty bad weekend, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, remember, they're incredibly well adjusted, and they have great, great therapy, apparently, and drugs.
Yeah, that's
so it's not really an issue.
Space therapy.
Okay, and of course, this is also the season in '91. It's actually fourth season where everyone's crazy for Star Trek. Roddenberry passes away.
Yeah.
Yes.
And at this point, Roddenberry had nothing to do with the show. He'd been completely ousted by third season, not second. And let me just finish, Don.
Okay.
I'm actually going here. We're going with someplace with this. And so you brought up like Earth's final conflict, and you brought up was it Andromeda? And
Andromeda,
everything?
yeah.
That's where this comes from.
Right.
Is that suddenly people were nuts for Star Trek. They were by default nuts for Roddenberry stuff. And that's why Majel Barrett was able to show up with his scripts and say, who wants these, what could be the next Star Trek script? And the other networks were like, me, give me.
Right.
And they were bidding for it left, right, and center. And that's why we got some of his other scripts made into shows.
And we had Deep Space Nine show up then too, right?
Yeah.
Yes, I believe Deep Space Nine did. And I interrupted Don. Don, I think, wanted to say something. Yep.
Okay. Because I was going to... What?
Go, sir.
Oh, no, go ahead.
I was going to say, Deep Space Nine is actually 93, so we actually got 2 more years to go.
Okay.
2 more seasons to go. Okay, but anyway, sorry. Continue.
Oh, because what I think had happened with the Next Gen, because when you get to the first season, you can kind of see all the parts are there, but they don't quite work.
Right.
And like I was saying, Roddenberry wanted to get away from the more military stuff. He is kind of, I think, like it's getting older, more mellowed out. Like I said, that's what killed the FASA game, because there was a bunch of books that were pretty much done that got canceled last minute because they didn't like Paramount and Roddenberry didn't like the tone, which is why we never got a Gorn book. But anyway, I digress.
Yeah, I know.
And I heard like
there's a great Gorn module I've got.
There is, but there was
I've got it too.
There was
Axinar?
supposed to.
Yeah.
No, No, you're thinking. No, Axinar is the Klingon one.
Okay, sorry. Go ahead. Yeah.
Axinar is the planet where the war between the Federation and the Klingons starts.
And exactly. Yeah.
Go ahead. You're thinking Demand of Honor.
That's it. Demand of Honor. I've got that one too. There you go.
I've got that one in my collection too.
There you go.
Gorns are awesome.
Yeah.
Yep.
But I heard by the end of the first season, Roddenberry himself, the reason he was getting edged out was because he was sick. He wasn't doing too well health wise.
Yes.
And I think that's why when the next guys came in, they kind of usurped it. And like you were all saying, they kind of made it more of an action adventure show.
However, Rick Berman very much says they kept the aspect of keeping too much personal drama between the characters because that was Roddenberry wanted. He spent a lot of time really feeling like he was filling the shoes of Gene Roddenberry and sort of at the feet of the master. So there was a lot of stuff changed, but not enough, kind of thing. Two things I wanted to say if I had a moment. I found out about Gene Roddenberry's death because I got woken up by one of my best friends who's a Trek person, and she was crying and sobbing, and I thought another friend of ours died because that's the last time I heard from her crying and sobbing, and it was Gene Roddenberry, and she couldn't even get it out. She was so upset. The other thing that was interesting, that Gorn incident, the original Gorn show called Arena. I don't know if you know, but they actually stole that from a science fiction short story, and they didn't know.
Yes, they did.
They didn't realize it. They had
the
guy
show.
who wrote it. Yeah. Well, no, there was a original short story, and I had read it.
Yeah.
I think it's Jerome Bixby or somebody like that. Maybe not. But the guy, I guess they did the script and everything. The guy wrote the script, sent it in, they approved it, and then one of their researchers went, "There's another short story exactly called Arena," and the guy went, "Oh my God, you're right." He didn't even get it until at that moment, and then they called the guy up, and the guy actually happened to be a Star Trek fan, and went, "Yeah, sure, you can use my script." And they went, "Oh my God, you just saved the show because it would have cost so much to have to rewrite that." So,
yeah, because that was used for an episode of the original Outer Limits too.
Cool.
That might have been the original script that was used as the Outer Limits thing. Yeah,
It could have
that
been.
would make sense.
Weird.
Yeah, very
Okay,
weird.
so Next Gen goes on, and Next Gen, though, I will argue, did get slightly more militaristic as it went on as well. I mean, they was it season 6 or 7, like they even Troy basically had to start wearing a regular uniform because she got dressed down for, why are you wearing your cat suit on the bridge by a stand-in captain?
Captain Jellicoe. That was a great Chain of Command, 2 episodes. That was a great episode. They got the guy, I forget the actor's name, but very famous. Ronnie Cox. Love Ronnie Cox. Famous for things like
last year.
Total Recall. He also was in RoboCop.
Yep.
And he gets to play a jerk really, really well. So.
Yes, he does.
Sorry to interrupt. That was great.
And no, that's okay. That's perfectly okay. And they had lots of great actors on Star. Because actually, that was another thing. There was a time when every actor, because it was so popular, wanted to be on Star Trek: The Next Generation, especially in its later seasons. It was actually pretty. It was a big deal to be on that show. And then that's why even Stephen Hawking is in an episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation.
Yes,
playing himself. On the holodeck, of course, but he's playing himself. I mean, there are real astronauts that are in there as like transporter crew people and whatever, and they because they had Mick Fleetwood, I believe, is in there, and there's like lots of actual stars that are in the background somewhere, or they just want to guest star on it somewhere.
Well, you have to this is a generation that grew up with the original Star Trek and were moved to go to space or moved to become scientists or engineers. There's a great story that James Doohan goes, and he's actually at like a nuclear power plant, and they're showing him stuff, and something was going wrong, and he does a lot of technical reading, and he went, "Did you try this, this, and this?" And it worked, and they were like, "Oh my God, Scotty just fixed our engines." It was a great little story that he talks about in some of this. I actually went to a couple of hard to believe, some Star Trek conventions, and I saw James Doohan, I saw William Shatner. In fact, James Doohan ran into one of my friend's cars, and he took her out for dinner because he felt so badly for it. He wasn't going to pay for the fixing of the car, but he took her out to dinner anyway. So.
Cheap bastard. Well, he is a Scot after all.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I mean by the way, folks, I'm a Scot too. I can say that. Anyway, all right. So actually, Don is also.
As am I.
My name has a silent syllable, so.
Well, actually, so we're all Scots here. All right.
I'm part Scot. My grandmother was a Guthrie, so.
There you go.
We'll let it slide.
Thanks.
Okay, this time, yeah, maybe. Okay, so anyway, so we don't want to be so Next Gen, going back to our topic, did actually have an influence. Like Next Gen actually kind of almost by itself helped start a new sci-fi boom, actually, because there was some syndicated sci-fi coming out and everything, but people really went nuts for like Star Trek: The Next Generation. In fact, they went so nuts for it, they created a spin-off series.
Yep.
Babylon 5, which has been mentioned, wouldn't exist without Star Trek: The Next Generation. I mean, if it wasn't so popular, no one would have been able to give, J. Michael Straczynski the money to actually make Babylon 5. I mean, it was a big deal at that point. Sci-fi became very popular.
Even though he did make it prior to Deep Space Nine. I want to point that out. It was like 1988. The pilot came out beforehand. So
yes,
yeah.
that is true. Babylon 5's pilot. He definitely planned it before Deep Space Nine, but I don't. No, but they didn't.
The pilot
came out at the same year.
Oh yeah. No. Yeah, you're right about that. But I just mean the pilot came out way before the series came out.
Not that far before. No, it only came out about maybe No, because what happened, the story, okay, since we'll get to Deep Space Nine, we might as well. So anyway, so the story goes that, this is the way I've heard it, is that J. Michael Straczynski, the creator of Babylon 5, hears that, that Paramount is thinking about a new Trek series. So he goes and he pitches them this idea of a sci-fi show that is not a Trek series, but he thinks, okay, they're interested in sci-fi, they're making money, let's do this. So he goes and pitches this story about this space station that's on the edge of nowhere, but it's kind of, and there's like all this conflict of different alien empires, it's on this border and everything. And they're like, oh, James, that's pretty interesting. Okay, well, don't call us, we'll call you. And they kind of sent him on his way. And then a short while later, they announced Star Trek Deep Space Nine, which is basically ripping him off. At least that's the version I've heard anyway. And
no, it absolutely did. It absolutely did.
They took a lot of his. They basically took a lot of his ideas, repackaged them, sold them to their boss, and so. But here's the catch, and this is why I say they came out at the same time. Is that so he found out about it. I think by the time he found out about it, he had already sold it to Warner Brothers, yeah, and so they were already in production, and and it literally came down to if he filed the lawsuit, Warner's would completely drop Babylon 5. Basically, he was at least scared that that's what was going to happen. Babylon 5 would never get made if he actually made a claim against Deep Space Nine. So that's why he never did. He basically walked away and said, I could get to make my show. Screw you guys, fine, whatever.
Right.
And so. That's the thing, right?
Yeah, you're right.
That's why I say they did come out at the same time and they came out within a year of each other too. In fact, I think
the pilot no, you're right. The pilot was done beforehand, and he showed it to them. It wasn't in the public at that point, and because he did, and it was afterwards that he got it in the public because he lost a lot of his actors going to the television series between that because there were a couple of years between when he put the pilot out to internally. And then when it actually came out, if you take a look at there's 3 or 4 characters that are gone. Yeah.
Oh, I know about the characters disappearing, but I didn't think they were because the pilot only airs like about a year.
94.
If I recall, right? Before, and then the series comes in like 95.
Yeah, no, sorry, the series is 94, so the pilot might have been a year before that. So
yeah, it airs a year before. But what you're saying is that he already had it, or at least a rough cut.
Yes, in the 80s.
Before then.
Yes.
I don't believe the late 80s because he wouldn't be able to pull off the effects that he does at that point. Okay. Maybe the effects were redone.
Yeah.
I remember reading a Starlog magazine. For those of you who remember, Starlog was a popular magazine.
I have some
at the time. Yeah, and there's one which an interview with him where he's talking about that, and he's talking about shopping the show around and everything, and how he hopes it's going to get off the air or get on the air soon.
Yeah.
But that magazine was like a year or so before the pilot actually aired.
Interesting. And this is an interesting sort of parallel because Star Trek did the exact same thing originally, the original Star Trek, pitching it to a network, and they said, we're not interested. And what did they come out with? Lost in Space. Mm-hmm. So they took the idea and went, we can make our own out of this. And they did the exact same thing. So, and Star Trek was obviously ticked off for reasons for doing that. And then what do? They turn around and did it to Babylon 5. Mm-hmm. But Babylon 5...
By this point, Roddenberry was gone, of course, too.
And by this time, Babylon 5, when it finally came out and went up against Deep Space Nine, it kept kicking its butt for all the awards. So there you go.
Well, award-wise, it did. And in fact, I would always maintain that, I think Babylon 5 and Deep Space Nine had this weird kind of rivalry, and I think that they brought out the best in each other. Like, I actually do think that one of the reasons why many people actually consider Deep Space Nine one of the best Trek series ever done.
Absolutely.
And
me included.
And I think, many people would argue, and I've always argued that it was partly because they had competition. They were looking at Babylon 5 going, well, what are they doing? Okay, well, what can we do?
I don't believe it was reciprocated from Babylon 5. And the reason why is J. Michael Straczynski had the 5 years written out. Actually, he had the 5 years almost entirely written out. And what was fascinating, I didn't realize this, is that he was so detailed about all of his the script writing that actually he lost the 5th season because this was before the years of computers where you would organize all this stuff, and he literally had it in like a board in his briefcase, and he was at a convention and lost it, which is why the 5th season of Babylon 5 is so uneven for the first half of it. It's one of the worst. Season 1 and Season 5 of Babylon 5 are terrible comparatively to 2, 3, and 4, but we're not talking about Babylon 5. But your DS9 literally looked at Babylon 5 and said, why are they doing so well? Oh, we need a war. And that's one of the things, because they needed conflict. They didn't have conflict. So suddenly we have the war with the Dominion, and wow, suddenly you can see their marks come up. But just like one of their most remembered episodes was the return of the Trouble with Tribbles, right? And that was still beaten award-wise over and over again by a Babylon 5 episode. So that'll tell you how powerful Babylon 5 was up against a juggernaut like Star Trek and still won. Well,
it won awards, but it got seen by a lot less people. Babylon 5 wasn't airing on as many stations because, remember, it was on this, the P10 network or whatever.
Sure.
The Warner Brothers network.
Yes.
And that had a much lower distribution than the Paramount one did. So Babylon 5 was kind of a critical darling, but it wasn't aired everywhere. Not as much as Deep Space Nine was. So some people probably never even saw it when it first aired.
Well, it's still you're right. It still reached, I'm looking at IMDb right now, and it's got an 8.3 in IMDb. Right. So it obviously it's a very popular show for the people who did it.
Apparently they sell DVD sets.
Yes.
Like hotcakes.
Yes.
I mean, even today, it's very well loved, and we'll talk about B5 on another episode because we could go off into a tangent there.
Yeah.
All right, so we'll do that B5 episode. But actually, one area though I think that B5 actually hurt Deep Space Nine though, and I'm perhaps a heretic on this thing, but I think that the war with the Dominion thing should have actually ended at the end of 6th season.
Right.
And B5 was smart in one area. And even though this might not have been his entire original plan, but Straczynski had his war basically end in Season 4 and then let Season 5 be kind of a return to normalcy, kind of a cool-down period, an aftermath season. And I think Deep Space Nine desperately needed that. Because if I remember right, it's been a while since I watched them, but Season 7 of Deep Space Nine, things are getting a little long in the tooth. Like, they're really pushing the war aspect.
Right.
But by this point, we've seen, 3 seasons of war. It's just like, oh, God, just get over with it. It's just, we don't care anymore. Look, okay, you've done your war thing, whatever. Yeah. But they literally push it right up into the last episode. Like, the last episode is the end of the war.
Now, to be fair, there's two things that are about that. Number one, the reason why it ended in 4 was he was threatened to be canceled in 4, and he didn't want to leave it hanging. So he wanted to finish it. He was able to pull a rabbit out of the hat and finish it because he said, look, I'm only wanting 5 years. Give me 5 years. The other interesting that we don't talk about, and this is another Star Trek connection, is that a lot of old-time Star Trek actors showed up in Babylon 5 in new character roles. Specifically, Walter Koenig Chekhov had a continuing character named Bester, who was a villain. But Michael Ansara, who was very famous playing a Klingon in Day of the Dove, he showed up as well as being this techno mage. Majel Barrett shows up playing in a character as well. So there's a lot of Star Trek crossover, which I think really helped Babylon 5 to find some more people to come and champion it.
He was drawing, from the sci-fi actor community basically as it existed at that point, which most of them were Star Trek vets, at least in one form or another. But anyway, so let's focus on Deep Space Nine. Okay.
Yeah, but this is a Star Trek connection, and I think you're not being. I don't think you're being fair, because who else hired Chekhov other than Starlost?
No, that's true.
Nobody did. Who hired Majel Barrett? Who hired Michael and Sarah? None of those people were being hired. He picked them very specifically because of the Star Trek connection.
I think he'd actually worked with Ansara before, because he ran Murder, She Wrote for years, and I think Ansara was on that.
No, that's a possibility. That's true.
We'll go with that. Okay, so Next Gen was finishing up, and Deep Space Nine finally, basically premiered and started up. And again, people weren't really that enthused about Deep Space Nine when it first started. It's the first show with a black captain, which was a big deal at that point. I mean, there weren't that many black lead actors.
Technically, it was, because one of the in Next Gen they showed one of the other captains that she was black as well.
That's true. In fact, it's right there in the first season, if I remember right. She's the up and coming actor who gets possessed by an alien symbiote thingy.
And I remember that, because when they go over her career, I'm like, that sounds a lot more interesting than the asshats they're making me watch.
Right. Oh, well, okay. So Next Gen, though, was influential, and so they wanted to continue on. So they made Deep Space Nine, and it was the first Trek series with a lead black captain. Lead.
There we go.
I think there might have been other black captains in Next Gen.
Yes.
Actually. But it was the first lead black captain. There were some black admirals too.
Yeah.
And so that was a big deal for the races, seeing people in the future. And Deep Space Nine, of course, has a more inward, dramatic focus, especially in the early seasons.
Well, there's
they changed that later on, but for the first beginning, it's a little more focused on. I guess if you could say, if Star Trek is Wagon Train to the Stars, Deep Space Nine was Gunsmoke. About this town basically where weird strangers
people showed up
each week and stuff. Well, people showed up. Exactly.
There's kind of a weird twist to that too, I think, though, because I think what made Next Generation popular was the time it came out in. You had a lot of like science fiction, but it was all like post-apocalypse. And if you watch any of the action shows, we're all about how like gangs and terrorists have like taken over and only the rogue cop can stop them. And I think it went back to that idea that Trek was one of the few upbeat things during that era. Like there was, and when you get into the 90s, you're getting into like the emo grunge thing.
Yep.
And that was something I didn't like about Deep Space Nine, because like you said, it goes inward, but I found the characters were, again, they were just as boring as the Next Gen guys, but they were whinier about it.
Well, yeah, they definitely had their issues, and they were definitely going for more inter-character conflict, sort of.
Yeah.
There was more conflict than there was with Star Trek: The Next Generation, but it was still Star Trek. Like, there was still only a limited amount of conflict, because they seem to be scared of actually having real conflict in a Trek show. Maybe it's because it's against the ethos, maybe it's because, I don't know, but they don't want to really have a lot of conflict among the characters, and so they've avoided it. And they will continue to avoid it for quite a while.
I got to tell you, though, too, I want to point out last thing about Next Gen is it's the worst show for holding up in time. I think the original Star Trek has much more legs for people to watch it now and appreciate it. Next Gen looks really dated.
I can see it looks dated, but I would argue that, okay, if you're just talking about appearance, then yes, I would say it looks dated. I agree. Partly also because we've seen that Next Gen look, but done much better and on a bigger budget later on. That doesn't help it either.
Like I tried, I've got 3 sons, and I tried to get them into all the different Star Treks, and Next Gen is the one that makes them yawn so much. The way the show is set up, it's just not as action oriented. It's just not as tension based. So it comes across really sleepy.
Well, that, and remember,
Okay.
if you get into the 90s too, remember that's when writing for any kind of science fiction show, characterization was no, angry, grr! And that's what everything like during that era was. And I can see next gen looks like Happy Valley Funtime compared to everything that came after it, because the characters, they talked. They weren't constantly on 11 screaming at each other and gritting their teeth.
And by modern standards, it's very slow.
Yeah.
It really is. I mean, and that's because that's how TV was done then. And it is a little more cerebral. And no, I still love Next Gen. I still think it's great. But again, I did grow up with it. And I will admit it has its good episodes and its bad episodes. I mean, it does get better as it goes along. There's actually a really good patch probably between, say, Season 3 and Season maybe 5 or 6, where Next Gen is actually really good. But I'm not going to lie and say that Season 1 and 2 and 7 are that great. They have their episodes, but most of them are not that good. And again, I can see why a modern audience would find it more slow.
Yeah.
That makes sense to me. And whereas Deep Space Nine is again starting to be a little more what we're used to now.
Yeah.
And they work with that. And Deep Space Nine did well. I mean, it was a popular show. Again, it was just kind of there. I mean, people liked it. I don't think it was really that influential overall outside of just being another Star Trek series, but it was a very popular one. People liked it.
Well, it was kind of the last popular one.
Yeah, exactly. Because, of course, before we go on, does anyone want to say anything else about Deep Space Nine?
Yeah, I think one of the things that struck me most about Deep Space Nine was it was one of the first times that they showed a Star Trek character actually as a coward. And that was Jake Sisko's son. And they dealt with his cowardice.
Jake Sisko was the son.
Sorry, Jake Sisko. Ben Sisko's son. Yeah, it's been a while since I watched Deep Space Nine. Ben Sisko's son was Jake. You're right. And he showed cowardice during a battle, and it was a real plot point. And it wasn't something that they just sort of he became brave by the end of the episode. No. He was a scaredy pants for a long time. And they recognize that this is part of what humanity is. Not everybody's brave, and bravery takes different kind of shapes. So that was a really powerful aspect. I like that more than I like in every iteration of Star Trek, with the exception of the original and the exception of the last one. There's always a few characters that I think are stupid, and I wish they never brought them. And I didn't really care too much for Quark. Odo didn't do anything much for me, kind of thing. But Jake was really a boring character until that moment, and then it was an interesting character. So that's my last bit about Deep Space Nine.
Okay. And of course, Next Gen finished about second season of Deep Space Nine. There's a short gap. Paramount at this point has decided to start the UPN, the United Paramount Network. And once again, it being a new era and a new TV network starting, they want to have a Star Trek show as their flagship because people seem to like this Trek thing. So they created Star Trek Voyager, which is a show that had a huge amount of potential that they then proceed to completely waste, at least from my perspective. Sorry, Voyager fans, but I'm not a Voyager
No,
fan.
Voyager is the worst of the Star Trek incarnations as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
Okay, I think I might agree with you on that one.
Yeah.
It has its good points.
Yes.
It did actually have a few good episodes scattered here and there.
Yeah.
But for those of you who aren't familiar, Star Trek Voyager is about the USS Voyager, which in the first episode gets basically chucked to the other end of the universe and basically has to make its way back.
Before we go too far there, I want to point out something else about that we didn't mention, is that in Next Gen, we saw characters transplant from Next Generation to Deep Space Nine, which had never been done before.
There's that too.
So we Worf, yeah, but let's not forget the transporter. O'Brien.
Yeah,
he was the main character from the very beginning. We also saw Jonathan Frakes' character, Riker, but his brother, his clone, his Transformer clone, Thomas Riker, show up as well. So they did have a lot more crossovers, especially while Next Generation was running. And that was kind of interesting for a lot of people because I think it brought people to the idea of trying out Deep Space Nine, which honestly, people were a little reticent because they didn't like the idea of getting off the Enterprise.
Yep.
So then we got back on a spaceship, Voyager, which, like you said, had some really good opportunities. We had a female character,
First
female captain, we had the Maquis, which would have been a really cool thing if they kept being problematic because they didn't like the Federation. But as soon as they get thrown into the Delta Quadrant, suddenly they're friends, and everybody works together on the ship, and we never hear about it anymore. There was one episode...
They kind of play with it for 2 seasons, but that's...
Not much. And I remember there's one episode that's much later that was called The Year in Hell, or The Year of Hell. Remember that?
Oh, yeah, of course.
And I was just like, that is what this entire series should have been. But instead, what did they do? They just rebooted everything at the end of it, and it's like, no, that never happened. And in The Year of Hell, they literally went through a year of what happened with people dying, the ship being ripped apart, unable to fix it, being really, really just awful, awful times, and then, oh yeah, well, we could just change that with a time loop, and now that never happened, and these people didn't die. I was like, if you had planned for the entire series of Voyager to kill off key characters at various different places and create this kind of tension, it could have been the best series of Star Trek ever.
I agree completely. Yeah, I think it would have had like Walking Dead type ratings back in those days.
Absolutely,
if they'd done that.
Absolutely,
because it would have been like, oh my God, who's going to survive? Who will make it through this season? And that kind of thing. People love that.
Yes,
and yet they squandered it. Like the whole cast. Spoiler: the whole cast. Okay, almost the whole cast makes it from the beginning to the end of Voyager, and that's it's boring. Like Voyager is basically just more generic Star Trek. With a kind of a fake premise that, by the way, we're trying to get home. But, of course, we can't get home until the series is over, so we're just going to keep pretending to try to get home for the next 7 years.
Yeah,
and it gets really boring.
Like, because they did a lot. Voyager had the problem. When it first started, you could kind of tell it was put together by executives because it was all just generic stuff. But as they went on and it kind of got into characters and that, it had the problem that they would point out what's an interesting idea, and then it never really gets played out.
For example,
my favorite example was Neelix, the little alien sidekick they pick up. He's actually in the story. He's fairly religious, and it was his sister, wasn't it, that he was hoping when his time was up that he'd go to their heaven.
He'd actually meet her. Yeah,
and in an episode he dies. But they bring him back hours later because at that point they have access to Borg technology and they fucking ruin the Borg on me. But anyway, they bring him back and he's distraught because during the time he was dead, there was nothing. It was blackness. He doesn't remember. There wasn't the tree. He didn't meet his sister. And he has this crisis of faith. And they did a good job through the whole episode playing it up. And it's like, that's cool. And then it just stops. And you're like, well, you didn't do any, and they did a bunch because there was the engineer that they did that she's half Klingon, and they did this thing where she was having these weird dreams of Klingon hell where all of her ancestors were dragging her onto the black ship, and it was interesting because it was supposedly this idea she was having trouble reconciling her human and Klingon sides, and that doesn't really end up. They didn't do anything with that, and then they do stuff like, if you've seen the series, you know what I'm referring to. There's the big love story at the end that literally comes out like 3 episodes before the end. And you're like, well, you didn't do any build up to that. It's not a horrible idea, but it didn't come out of anything. It was just, and then this, okay. And the other thing that they did too, that kind of ties in, was you had the captain who was supposed to be this like uber genius, but they never gave you a clue how to take that. So it always kind of felt like bad writing because Star Trek, going back to the original one of the things the fans got into was the technology.
Yeah.
And the consistency and the plausibility internally for the tech. And one of the things that Trek always had was that things were so complicated, you didn't have, except Wesley Crusher, whoever he wanted to flush out an airlock, anybody who was good at everything. And even then, Wesley was a whiny little weenie and had no command potential in that. But you get to Captain Janeway, and, like, she's an engineer, she's a captain, she's warlike. There's an episode where she helps the doctor do heart surgery.
She can do everything that the crew can do as well as they can do. And like, she literally is a master of everything.
So she's Superman of the Justice League, is what you're saying.
Yeah. And there's and this is where I say, like, it ties in with all these other the complaints I had, because there's nothing wrong with doing that, but they never gave you that in as to, is this like an Ubermensch or is it bad writing? Even to the point that if they had somebody when they're doing like heart surgery and she's like, I'll join in to help. If one of the other people goes, Captain, how the hell do you know how to do heart surgery? And she said something like, well, my uncle wanted me to be a doctor and I apprenticed with him for 2 years, or some stupid thing like that to make you, okay, she's just supposed to be awesome.
Yeah.
But they never took that idea anywhere. It was just, here's some stuff.
Or I was stationed on a starbase, everybody died who could do any kind of surgery. I had to learn, meatball surgery, aka MASH, and I spent 5 years doing that before they came with help. Stuff like that would have been amazing.
And it would have been, but there's no interest in their backgrounds.
And you know why that is? Really. Here's my answer as to why that is. Franchises kills story. The moment you make something a franchise, the moment you put it in stone and say we can't do anything to change it for fear that we won't be able to sell stuff to people, we won't be able to sell it into syndication because it'll be out of order and people won't be able to see it properly and won't make any sense to people. We can't do real changes in the character for those reasons. So the moment Star Trek became a franchise was the moment it started to die as a story.
Maybe.
Kinda. I mean, there's still... I always got, like I said before, I always got the impression from Voyager that it was just the exec saying, okay, this is popular, this, throw that all in, throw this in, make them fight a giant spider, that kind of thing, eh? Like,
Yep.
I don't know if anyone gets my giant spider reference, but
of course.
Yeah, we do.
Okay.
And yes, I agree. Voyager was basically just corporate crap. Also, they had a few other issues behind the scenes. They also had the first female showrunner, Jerry Taylor, who many have said, I don't know if this is true or not, that basically saw Janeway as her personal Mary Sue, and that's part of what was also going on, is that she wanted Janeway to be this, perfect representation of a, hardworking, competent, capable woman. And so that accidentally made the show basically focus on Janeway and basically did her best to kind of neuter the other male characters.
And female and other, because like we were saying,
well, yes and no.
Janeway just did it all.
So did you say
Janeway does it all?
Who did you say did that? You say Jerry? I thought it was Kate.
Jerry Taylor.
I thought it was Kate Mulgrew who played her.
No, Jerry Taylor was the showrunner.
Oh, she was the showrunner. Okay, who's
Jerry Taylor?
Who's
Kate Mulgrew was Janeway.
Okay, I thought you were talking about Jerry. What's her name? Who played 7 of 9? That's why I got confused.
No, that's another Jerry.
That's right. Okay, fair enough.
There's the other Jerry, and we'll get to her in a second. So basically, what happens is Jerry Taylor is there, and she's there for, I believe, it's like 3 seasons. Okay. And then, coincidentally enough, she's out, and what's the first thing that happens? Oh, 7 of 9 gets brought in.
Right.
Because we're no longer watching the Jerry Taylor Janeway show at that point. Where they're now like, well, we need to boost the ratings, we need to bring things in, so we're going to bring in the board, and we're going to bring in a sexy board. And at that point, it literally goes from being a one-person show, the Janeway show with her supporting cast, to a 2-person show, the 7 of 9 show in her hot, sexy suit, and Janeway, and slowly becomes the 7 of 9 show.
You know what I really missed? That Jerry was in. What's her last name again?
Jerry Ryan is the actress who played 7 of 9. Yeah.
You know what I miss her in the most? The show that they canceled that I loved her in?
What?
Dark Skies.
I never watched Dark Skies, so I can't.
I love that show. Did you ever see that show, Don?
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, it was like X-Files the way it should have been. So it was really quite cool. Anyway, sorry. Bit of a tangent there.
So,
that's how she got hired, though, is because she was so popular in Dark Skies.
Right.
So.
Okay, I believe it. Although Dark Skies might have actually come after that.
No.
I think they were contemporary.
Yeah.
Because I think Dark Skies got canceled and then came back and then got canceled for good.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. That's entirely possible.
Yeah.
That's entirely possible. Okay, because she was apparently. Oh, let's see. Well, okay, fine. Let's just settle this since we're nerds. We'll actually check it. Let's see. Nerd fight, nerd fight. All right, so where we go? Dark Skies was 97, and she joins Voyager in 97. They were contemporary.
Yeah.
The first season of Dark Skies, 8 episodes, is Juliet Stewart.
Well, that's why I said she
And
started off in Dark Skies, and that's why they hired her afterwards, right?
Possibly.
Because she was popular.
And then she would go on to win a whole bunch of awards. Actually, I didn't realize that for 7 of 9. Because everyone loves 7 of 9, which is partly why it became the 7 of 9 show, basically.
Yeah,
after a
and to
certain
be
point.
fair, because 7 of 9 was the only character that did anything.
And the only character that was truly conflicted.
Yeah, and the only character was interesting, you could argue.
Yeah.
I mean, it's sad, but it's true. I mean, she was an actual. She's a character that literally grows and changes as the show goes on.
Yeah.
I mean, this show from the moment she's introduced basically becomes this arc, partly about 7 of 9 and her reconnecting with humanity because she was, of course, taken as a kid to become a Borg.
Yeah.
And that's actually not bad. I mean, she meets other Borg and she helps shepherds a bunch of children that were taken as Borg and then freed and stuff. She goes through this whole arc, and that's one of the reasons why it becomes the Borg show after a little while as well.
Yeah, that's fine because they ruined the Borg years ago, so that's okay.
Well, exactly. So that's okay. Yeah, I know Hugh. Anyway.
Oh no, before Hugh.
No, I think Hugh was pretty much the one that ruined the Borg.
No,
absolutely.
I thought the whole Best of Both Worlds thing ruined the Borg.
I would disagree with that. Why do you think
most people would?
Okay. Why do you think so, Don? Because I agree that Hugh ruined the Borg. My reasoning is simply this. Once you put a human face on evil, it becomes less scary.
Yeah, and it's kind of the thing, because the idea with the Borg and what made them great villains on Star Trek was they weren't individuals. Like Trek was about all these different people and different species and that getting together, whereas the Borg, you were just absorbed into the one big massive collective.
Yep.
And they were implacable. You couldn't reason with them. There was nothing to deal with. They just showed up and consumed.
Yeah.
And it was interesting, but you could tell that they sort of wrote themselves into a corner, because how do you stop that? And that was kind of my problem when you got to the Best of Both Worlds, which was a really good episode. I remember going into the Gaming Society after the first part, and we were all sitting there chanting, Borg, 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 because all the other guys there were Trekkies, and we thought that was hilarious. But it was the idea that, okay, so they turn Picard into Locutus. Well, right off the bat, why would they bother? They've obviously already met humans. They've already absorbed all the knowledge from the Federation. They've already demonstrated the Federation stuff is useless. They could have got the secret of turning the sensor array into an anti-Borg weapon just by absorbing Picard. You didn't have to make him a personality. But okay, it's weird and it's creepy, and we'll go with that. But it bothered me that then you put them all to sleep and they blow up, because they illustrated in the first part of that episode why that wouldn't work. Because remember, they were hitting the power couplings, and the idea was you'd never take out enough to really short out the ship, but you sing them a lullaby and they explode. And I always thought that was kind of a rip-off to the Borg. And then Hugh was horrible, because now they're not the Borg anymore. You've put a personality. And then you get to the movies and you find out the Borg ships carry like a spare sexy chick, and you're like, okay, we're done.
Yeah, the Queen Borg was a terrible idea too, in my opinion. Yeah.
I agree. Although, and here's a weird bit of next-gen trivia, the intent was for the Borg to actually be insects. They weren't supposed to be, machines in the original plan, but they couldn't afford to do it.
Right.
They couldn't afford the effects or the CGI at that point to actually do what they wanted to do with an insect race. So instead, they just said, well, we can glue a bunch of machine parts onto people and call them cyborgs. And they're like, okay, that works. And so that's what they went with.
Let's be honest, though, it is a ripoff from Doctor Who, the Borg, right?
Yeah, basically.
They are Cybermen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's hard to argue that they're different.
But they weren't planned to be. That's actually partly the result, supposedly anyway, of creative, we'll call it evolution, so to speak, because the original plan was for them. In fact, I've even heard I don't know if this is true or not, that there's this episode in season 1, and we even referenced it earlier, where they discover that there's these like weird alien brain bugs that are taking over the Federation.
That was an awesome episode, and they never followed up
indeed.
with it. If I was going to do Trek fiction, I would bring those guys back.
Well, the rumor I've heard, I don't know if this is correct or not, was that that's what they were supposed to be the advance for the Borg. That was the plan. Those were those weird brain bugs. No, that was like the advanced whatever units of the Borg. But the insect Borg, not which would have called something else, not the mechanical ones.
Right.
And if you think about that, would have been awesome. That would have been a much better thing. But unfortunately, again, they didn't feel they could do it budget-wise, so that happened.
How cool was that blowing up at the end of that episode, by the way? That was
I think that freaked a lot of people out.
That was so graphic for Star Trek.
Yeah.
Oh, that was so super graphic.
Yeah.
In fact, for the TV of the time, that was horrifically graphic.
Yeah.
They melted a guy.
Oh, and he exploded everywhere. Yeah.
Yeah, you watch his skin get
Peeled
peeled
off.
off in layers, and then you got his head and his face, and suddenly it just explodes, and it's like, oh my god.
And there's just this little nod from Picard to Riker, like, oh, this stunt's not going to work. Let's fry the bastard. You know, like, just that look on his face, like, okay, we can do this.
Yep, exactly. And no, that was awesome, and that episode was set up over a period of a couple episodes, actually, if you recall.
Yep.
And that episode I think affected a lot of people, and people always wonder why didn't that come back? And the answer is because it was supposed to. It was the plan. At least that's what pretty sure I've heard. We can probably find some Trek lore somewhere that'll confirm or deny that.
Right.
Anyway, all right. So we're already over 2 hours, so we should probably get heading towards finale on this one.
Ta-da.
All right. So Voyager came out, and Voyager did not do so well by the end. Its ratings were really flagging. DS9 disappeared halfway through Voyager as well. So at that point, Voyager was the only Trek show on the air, and they weren't sure whether it was worth doing more. So they kind of let it go, and they hemmed and they hawed for a bit. And then they finally decided, well, we've got this network, and we want to do another Trek show, so okay, fine. We'll do one more called, of course, Star Trek Enterprise, which they decided to make a prequel out of. Meanwhile, before I just go into Enterprise, there had been some next-gen movies, and they pretty much all sucked. So I'm just not going to talk about them.
Yeah,
I think we can all agree on that.
they were all
right?
terrible, yeah. I mean, one that was the best was basically would have been better as a television episode, and that was Insurrection. It was like a television episode that they tried to make fly in a theater.
Yeah.
And that was probably their best option that they had, right? So
Yeah.
Actually, to be honest, I actually liked First Contact. I mean, it has its issues, but of them, I actually enjoyed that one the most. I mean, again, that's the Borg thing and everything else, but as an overall story, it kind of works, and it's okay.
Yeah, but
I found I was going to say I found the whole Riker Troy thing to be really saccharine and just awful. And
yeah, but that's a pretty small part of that movie.
Yeah, but it was enough to turn me off of it. and the fact that I didn't like they ruined Star Trek convention. I mean, they went back and changed, because if you go and look at the books, originally Zefram Cochrane is actually from Alpha Centauri. He's not a human being.
Yes.
yeah,
So
he's in the original show.
Yeah.
He's in the original
Exactly.
show, yeah.
And that's the thing. But I mean, they talk about him in the book as being from Alpha Centauri as well. So I don't like when you destroy all of, a major aspect of history in your. They're very careful about it for everything, and then they just go back and rewrite everything in the movie. I didn't understand why they did that.
Yeah.
So.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, and actually, that's a perfect segue, if you don't mind, into Enterprise, because that's what they did with Enterprise.
Yeah,
too.
and that's
Enterprise is a prequel.
and that was the problem I had with that movie, is that it's the first time you saw them really kind of screw around with the Star Trek continuity. And I think that sort of opened up the floodgates, because that movie did pretty well, as I recall.
Yeah.
Yes, it did.
Yeah,
and then
First Contact did do quite well.
And then I
probably
think
their best one in a long in its history. I would say it probably did the best of all of them. Yeah.
And that puts that idea of, well, we got like this established setting, but nah. And then you get Enterprise.
Yeah.
Which, of course, starts with a quote-unquote temporal Cold War, which is apparently going on, where different factions from the future are trying to mess with the past.
Yeah.
which was they're out so they could actually have Enterprise muck with the timeline all they wanted and just blame it on the temporal Cold War thing that they had.
Now, to be fair, like Enterprise, I love. I think it's the best of the spin-offs. I really do. There's not a single character there I don't like. In fact, many of the characters have real struggles that you deal with. The communication officer hates being in tight places, hates being in space. The engineer, very much like McCoy, has that same kind of feel to him. He and Malcolm Reed don't get along for most of all this. The Vulcan lady is the sexiest one of them all, and probably the one who does Vulcan as well as Spock compared to some of the others. She really got the feeling for Spock. And I love backstory. I love when you can pull in a story and tell the story behind the story and do it in such a way as it fits things in. Yeah, the temporal war thing was a mess, but it really wasn't the major focus of the entire series. It only sort of...
Well, because they dropped it fairly soon because they realized it wasn't
Yeah,
working.
but it also was only in a couple of episodes. Those episodes at the very beginning were all sort of singular episodes. And then they tried to tie everything together with The Expanse. That's when they started to pull stuff together. And then when they knew they were going to be canceled, they had some really interesting episodes that were 2- and 3-parters, which has never been done in Star Trek before. One was The Dark Universe, which was awesome to go back. They'd done a fairly decent version of it in Deep Space Nine, but to go back and do it with title credits, an entirely different theme song, was just a really cool idea. So there was a lot of really cool stuff about it. They answered the question about the Klingons. There have been people nagging at people ever since the Klingons were remodeled in the first movie. It's like, why do they look so different? Well, they came up with a decent answer about that. So they had some really cool stuff. They took a look at Noonien Singh, not Khan Noonien Singh, but the guy who created Data. And they gave him a backstory and what he was trying to do, and they fit him in with the eugenics war. So there was some really cool stuff that they did that they filled in.
I would...
Actually, Dr. Noonien Singh, that is...
Yeah, Noonien Singh. By the way, the writer I was saying that I really loved, he was the executive producer of Enterprise. His name was Manny Koto. So I love Manny Koto's writing. I've seen him in other stuff, and I just really, really dig the way he puts stuff together. So...
Okay. Okay, Don, you go.
I was going to say, if you liked the characters in that, you would love Perry Rodan, because Star Trek Enterprise looks like they took a Perry Rodan show, changed the title, changed the names, and then on the air you go. Like, it's weird. If you look up the model for the Perry Rodan Galador, one of their spaceships, it looks like the Enterprise without the nacelles from the show. Like, it's really... I thought that was so weird that it's... The characters and the interaction are so much the Earth Empire storyline from Rodan.
Well, this is
actually, having read some Perry Rodan, I can confirm it is. Really
I've read Perry.
It's odd how much
I hadn't thought of that myself, but I have Perry Rodan books myself, and I agree. But here's the other thing: is that Enterprise brought back danger.
Yeah.
You didn't get that since the original series. You didn't get the idea that, you know what, we could totally be blown up here. In Next Generation, you really felt like there was like a moon shuttle conductor thing going, that they were just shuttling people back and forth, and the odd scary thing would happen. But in Enterprise, the ship could fall apart. They didn't have shields. They were meeting people all the time that were way outclassing them.
Right.
And so there was a lot more of that, oh my God, we're in a submarine in the middle of dangerous waters feel, which I loved. That was the great part that I loved about Star Trek. Like, one of my favorite original Star Trek episodes is Balance of Terror, where they're fighting the Romulans along the neutral zone. The Romulans are blowing up all the star bases, because it has that real sense of danger. And you're right. That goes back to, all those Space Cadet shows and stuff like that, that same sense of we're on the frontier. Yeah. And maybe it's just I love the good frontier space shows. That could be it.
Right. Okay. And I'm gonna, and you know what's coming, Jack. I know you know what's coming. The answer is, I can't say I hate Enterprise, but I do not like Enterprise at all. I found Enterprise boring and derivative. I thought they brought in way too many aspects of the Star Trek technology as fast as they possibly could. You say there's no there's no shields. Yeah, but they're magical hull plating that they came up with, which never shows damage, but functions exactly like the shield.
Wait a minute, what do you mean never shows damage? They nearly blow the ship up all the time. It has to go back it has to go back to be refitted 3 times in the series. It's so badly damaged that you can see sparks in half the shows coming through the hull. The polarized.
I disagree.
Go back and look at the series.
No, you can't.
Oh yeah, go back.
No,
I've watched it 3.
I was just watching it last year. Okay, here's the catch. I was just rewatching it last year because I thought Jack loves it so much. There's got to be something here. I'm going to go back and I'm going to try watching it. No, it's awful. I couldn't sit through it. I can't stand it.
I've rewatched it 3 times now with 2 different sons, and
okay, well you've watched it more than I have. You apparently have a stronger stomach than I do. I'll give you points on that.
Well, I mean, it's just extremely well done. It's really dramatic storytelling, which I
no, it's not.
Okay.
See, you had your chance. This is mine, dude, and I'm gonna take it.
Fine.
The characters are all incredibly derivative. Archer is boring as hell. He's like the most passive captain, and in fact, actually, I like Janeway more than I like Archer because Archer is he's so Scott Bakula. He's so laid back. He's so, hey man, okay, let's do. The other characters, Phlox is okay. I agree with you. Jolene Blackhawk as T'Pol is actually she was T'Pol, right? Yeah. And I will agree with you. Actually, she's one of the best characters on the show when she's not being forced to do fan service, whatever. The communications officer, she was all right. And the other guy, like the characters actually are okay, but I find them very muted. The first season is okay, but it's a little bit dull. Because they're like trying for the exploration thing, but they don't really want to actually explore. So they're like, well, we'll still just kind of do vague Star Trek-y stuff. Okay, fine. Second season, okay, we're not getting good ratings. Okay, let's put a little more action in. So they start doing a little more action-packed stuff. Still not working. Third season, they do the whole Zinti arc, the Zinti, I think they were
Cindy
like
with
that.
a D.
Cindy, there we go. Zinti arc. Which I thought, and at the time I remember going, wow, this, okay, I'd pretty much given up on the show, but like, the Zindy arc, okay, well, that sounds interesting. They're going to do a whole season on one idea, one main theme. Brilliant idea. I wish Star Trek had done this years ago. Let's watch it. Wow, that was really boring. I mean, it really had no bite to it whatsoever. And then though, they did season 4. And I can tell you that by season 4, even the showrunners, Brick Berman and Brandon Braga, had basically walked away. Because the ratings were so bad, no one was watching it. And they said, we're contracted for one more season. Here, Manny Kodo, you take it. And that's where what I would argue is the only good season of Enterprise came from. I will agree with you about Manny Kodo. And you know one of the reasons why it's good? Because Manny Kodo was a Trek fan. And he said, if you're going to do a Star Trek series, you should be referring to Trek. See, the thing is, and they did this on purpose, Brick Berman and Brandon Braga had a rule for the first 3 seasons of Enterprise, which is we're not going to bring back any characters, we're not going to do any callbacks, they basically they wanted to make a non-Trek series is what they wanted. And they did it, and that's what they did, and that's partly why it was so boring. And then suddenly, even you were gushing about, all the stuff you're gushing about happens to come from the 4th season, which is the only time it really was a Trek series, where Manny Kodo was making it a Trek series, because it was constant callbacks. In fact, it almost gets annoying how many callbacks there are. And I would argue that the only time Enterprise is actually anything resembling a good series is that 4th season. But those previous first seasons were boring as hell, and the ratings went down and down every season. And I'm going to take that as my proof that it really wasn't that good a show. Sorry, man. Your turn. Fire back.
I can disagree with you because you don't like Babylon 5. So I think we have a definitively disagreement as to what makes a good series. I think the only reason Enterprise lost people watching it was because they were bored of watching Star Trek. It had been on the air 15 years. I had heard a lot of people go, yeah, I didn't bother watching Enterprise because I thought I was done watching Voyager. Voyager put a bad enough taste in people's mouth that nobody watched Star Trek Enterprise.
I actually do agree with you on that. I do think there was a fair amount of Trek fatigue, even for me at that time.
If you put Enterprise up right after Next Generation, or even before Next Generation, people would be calling it the best series that was ever made.
I think that's way...
No, if you go and take a look at Next Generation, and you take any of the regular episodes of Next Generation and take a look at the regular episodes of Enterprise, the characters are far more developed. They have far more flaws. There's far more attention going on between them. There's far more danger going on in every single episode. You didn't mention all the different subplots that they had between the Andorians, which was really awesome to see the Andorians again, which you don't see anymore. The actor who played the main Andorian, I forget his name, he's awesome in it. Jeffrey Combs is fantastic.
He was fantastic. In fact, and again, he's a fourth season. He was there before the fourth season.
He was before the fourth season, yes.
But he really only became a real strong element of the show in the fourth season. And supposedly, if they'd gotten a fifth season, he was actually going to join the crew because he was so beloved. And people did really love him.
But that's the thing is, Andorians are amazing, and they set up way before the fourth season. They set up the whole problem between the Vulcans and the Andorians, which is part of Trek history. So they screwed that up. That's a problem. What about the whole aspect about the scene with T'Pol? Series of episodes with T'Pol flirting with the fact that she's feeling human emotions for the first time and wants to find more, and basically damages her own nervous system, chasing the dragon to become like more human-like. I didn't like at the end where it went, but I appreciate the fact that they didn't want to just stay with her being a static character. What about the fact that they blew up half of Florida, which never happens in Star Trek? That would have been a Babylon 5 thing. Yeah, but
that was because it was that was a total 9/11.
Yeah, no, but
it came out after 9. That was their reaction.
But that wasn't the only time. Let me finish. That's not the only time they did that. They blew up the beloved admiral that was his best friend, the captain's best friend, and they took out a whole deck full of people. That was a massive shock that happened. You don't see those in Star Trek episodes regularly. So, yeah, you can say Archer is boring.
They didn't do that on a regular basis on Enterprise either. That was a
okay. You don't see that on Enterprise. I can't imagine. I can't remember another episode of Star Trek that had that kind of shock level of killing everybody. They did it in Babylon 5, but they didn't do it in Star Trek. And you can call Archer boring. I thought he was refreshing, and he said very specifically, I'm trying to reflect back upon the series of adventures of a Captain Kirk-like captain. And yeah, there were times that he wasn't just quiet and calm. He started off that way. You can see him devolve through the seasons where they say, hey, this isn't the way you would behave before. And he's like, yeah, you know what? We're all going to die. So I'm going to do whatever we have to do to make sure that we get through this. He wasn't the pleasant captain after a while. He was the guy who was going to make sure by hook and by crook they all made it back to Earth, which they didn't. By the way, they also had all the Marines on the ship. What happened to them? They all died. They got completely wiped out. The Makos got completely wiped out. When has that ever happened in Star Trek again?
You mean red shirts?
No, we're talking about red shirts. Are different because that's 1 and 2 and stuff like that. We're talking about an entire team of people that started off at the beginning of one season and were killed off at the end. A red shirt lasts for a single episode. These guys These guys were semi-regular characters.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah, I will take your word for it because after a certain point I was so bored I was only watching like every second or third episode when it was available. I was not enjoying it at the time. By the way, it only has a Metacritic rating of like 66% and a user score of 6.9.
Yeah, I said, people were bored of Trek.
There's something missing from you guys' debate. Dun 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 dun.
All I can tell you, Rob, is this: I have 3 sons. 2 of them have watched Star Trek with me, and I did not spend any time saying this is the best series. This is the best series, and bar none, both of them said they find the other series boring. The only ones that they really find exciting to watch are Enterprise and the original Trek.
See, I think, though, that with that, Enterprise would appeal to them because, like we were saying at the beginning, it's of their era.
Yes, it's much more modern.
Yeah, like 2004.
It's still closer than
it's still written closer.
Next Gen is like 30 years old. But you can kind of see it.
And the original Star Trek is in the 60s, so what's your point?
It is, but the original one was something very different and very new. Like, I saw Enterprise. I didn't hate it. I didn't like it, but you can see a lot of similarities to other contemporary things. Like, a lot of the aesthetic, especially, say, the uniform aesthetic, it looks like the not Babylon 5, the Battlestar Galactica reboot.
Yeah.
Luckily, everybody wasn't amped up to 10 on fucking Enterprise all the time. But there's a lot of that kind of aesthetic. One of the things that bummed me out about it was I kept watching it going, why can't we have a Perry Rodan series? But
we did. It was called Enterprise.
Kind of, yeah. And like I say, I didn't find it bad. I think you're sort of right about the Star Trek fatigue. I think also what was happening is they didn't play up the Star Trek-ishness of it enough. So you could have called it something else and maybe fixed both problems, because the old fans wouldn't be expecting certain things that they didn't get, and the new fans wouldn't be expecting certain things either.
Well, it's already got the prequel problem,
yeah.
Right? There's already a certain element of feeling taken out of it by the very fact it's a prequel.
Yeah.
And so because of that, there's no real great epic danger, right? The Federation will survive. Mm-hmm. These characters will presumably survive because they're the main characters.
No, but there's no. But the thing is, there's no mention of these characters in the original Star Trek, which means they could totally die.
They could, but I think what Rob's getting at, it gets like there was a lot of stuff with the humans and the Vulcans were squabbling throughout Enterprise. Well, we know where that's going to go.
Yeah, and we
know where all the major plot
well, that's the
stuff
thing
is
we want to see. My point is, we want to see how they got there.
See, I don't. I know where they're going. I want to see something
new.
Yeah, like especially say Star Trek. There's so much going on in all of the shows. You could set one any time period. You could set one past the last series. Like, that's one of the things I didn't like about the new movies either, because I don't need to see the origin of everybody. A lot of it's understood, and then when you present it, it ends up being more of a letdown than
I love backstory. I'm surprised about this, because for me, seeing how what's the word? It's how combative the Vulcans are and how disdainful they are of human beings through the Enterprise. My whole thought is, how do they ever decide to join the Federation? What exactly? Because they never mentioned in the original series. I want to know that story. I want to know how they suddenly decided, this is a species that we can consider equals, because there is no way they were considering them as equals in Enterprise.
It's easy. So, it's the only logical decision.
No, but it's not, because they're the most illogical series. A group of.
I agree, Jack. I agree. Enterprise is illogical.
A series of human beings, species. There you go. But no, that's my point. Is that I was so enthralled about the idea of, I belovedly loved all this stuff about Trek, and now you're going to tell me the stories I've always wanted to know.
Well, then I guess you're going to love Star Trek Discovery.
See, because
Because again, it's another prequel set in between Enterprise and the original series.
Yes.
That's what gets me. Why just don't go piss me off? Because the whole thing about how did the humans and the Vulcans get together, I never wondered that, because the Vulcans always had Idic, and the Vulcans are the ultimate expression of logic, and that's their goal. And it would only be logical when you go out into the bigger universe to realize that association with something different, as dictated by the Idic, would be the logical, reasonable decision. And here's this other species that they seem at least as productive as you are, and you can work with them. And I didn't need to see the run-up. I was perfectly cool with where the series started.
And the Vulcans weren't assholes until Enterprise made
No, they were assholes in the Ponfar episode in the original.
Oh,
they were always dicks.
This is the thing, is the central crux about Vulcanism is they pretend to be based on logic, but they really are full of their own prejudices.
Mm-hmm.
And so having them get over that prejudice because you want to know what is that moment that happens, that moment that Kirk turns the Klingon, so that the Klingon Empire suddenly considers him to be a friend as opposed to a foe.
We're going to agree to disagree on Enterprise.
But thank you for the discussion. I appreciate it.
Okay, and thank you, Jack. We've had it before. We'll probably have it again. So anyway.
Yes, it's called Babylon 5. Sorry.
We're actually, we're going to do a Babylon 5 episode too, and we will bring you back, and we will actually go through Babylon 5, because I'd actually look forward to doing that as well. So, and if you want to hear the Star Trek arena music, that's where that's going to kick in. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. The point is that, okay, so since we've discussed about Enterprise, that is the last Star Trek series.
Yes.
We have had the new movies since then, which I would argue, I don't know if you guys would agree with that the new movies are basically generic space adventure with Star Trek slapped onto it. I mean, they're trying to be as hyperactive and hyperkinetic as they possibly can, and it's just people running around nonstop, shooting stuff at each other and yelling and screaming and stuff blowing up. And even J.J. Abrams, who did them, confessed that he doesn't like Star Trek. I mean, I was always more of a Star Wars guy. Well, he got his wish. He just directed a Star Wars movie, and I didn't like that one either. So, I mean, I'm going to have to go with, I'm going to have to say that they're Trek movies, but it's pretty much in name only. And I know that there are some fans that do love them, though, and okay, that's fine. Well, correction, they love the first one.
Yeah. I like the first one, but I think I'm listening to you guys, and I think the reason is that I love pulp. And I think Trek, in like the original 60s Trek, Enterprise Trek, you can call it more generic, but I think they're pulp adventures, and so I love them for that reason. That's my kind of thing.
I think part of the problem, they're pulp adventures, but I think my problem is they've taken the whole intellectual side of Star Trek completely out. Yeah. It's completely removed at this point.
Sure.
And that's where I don't like them. Actually, I'm lukewarm on the first of the Abrams Trek movies. I actually didn't mind the third one, actually. I was more okay with that one, in fact. And in the pulpy sense. Plus, it actually, I think, had a little more thoughtfulness to it in some ways. Only a tiny, tiny bit, though. Very tiny. So anyway, so that happened. I mean, and of course, partly because Enterprise did so damn poorly. Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. Sorry, let me rephrase. It's partly because Enterprise didn't do so well by the end. It ended Trek basically up until, from what? That would be 2005 until 2017. So we're looking at 12 years without any Trek except for the
Kinda.
Although, I will say, I had heard that there was a part of the contract for the Trek movies was they weren't allowed to do a Trek series while Abrams was making Trek movies.
Yeah,
yes, I heard that too, yeah.
There was a series that they were working on before the new movies. And it was, I've seen production shots now. It was going to be an animated one, and they wanted to bring it back more to the original series. It was set after Voyager, but the idea was that they had gone to war with the Romulans, and the Romulans had used some weird kind of like time displacement bomb, and it created these areas that it wrecked the kind of the fabric of space, so you couldn't use proper warp travel through these areas, and you couldn't use the high-tech communications and that. And it looked like they were trying to get more back to the stripped-down tech from, like, the original series. But I don't think... It never got made. They did, like I said, I saw production designs from it. It was very 1990s looking, animation-wise.
Right. Yep. I know Paramount actually did receive a whole string of people pitching Trek series. Like, a whole string of them over the last 12 years. Even Michael Dorn pitched one, the guy who played Worf, and a whole bunch of high-profile names, if I recall right, including Bryan Singer pitched one.
Seth MacFarlane pitched one.
Yeah,
he did. We're gonna get to see that as the Orville,
I suspect, but
whatever. Yeah, we'll get to that in a second. Anyway, so now here we are. And
one more thing we need to mention, though, and that's the fan fiction stuff that was made as movies.
Yeah.
In YouTube. Star Trek Continues, I think, is my favorite. I think it's really grabs the feeling of Star Trek and the less pulpy version. So you would appreciate that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh no, Star Trek Continues is not bad actually. And of course Star Trek New Voyages or Phase Two or whatever they
Yeah,
called it. I actually kind of like those.
me
Actually,
too.
I
Yeah.
liked James Crawley. I think it was his name. He had a kind of charm to
Yep.
him. He did a decent Kirk impression, but we still made it his own.
Yes.
And yeah, they did some neat stuff. I mean, there's Star Trek Hidden Frontier, which did like 50
Yep.
episodes.
Wow.
And there was a couple other fan series, and fans basically kept the show going over the
Yeah.
years, and that shouldn't be underestimated. I mean, Paramount basically gave up on Trek, and the fans kept it alive and kept it going.
And then
Paramount let them
and then
continue.
Axanar killed everybody.
Yeah.
I think Axanar was an excuse.
Mm.
I think the truth is, especially with a new Trek series in mind and Trek starting to make money again, Paramount wanted an excuse to whack the fan show.
I think that the story is that Axanar was honestly never supposed to be made. That actually it was a way to make money for people who were going to just want to jump on the bandwagon of Star Trek and make money off the backs of it. And so it was never expected to be made, and that's where they got angry. Because they thought they're just using the name to fundraise for their own pockets, and they're not even making the show. That's the word I heard.
Well, okay. I think actually that was part of it. The versions that I've read are that they were going to make Axanar, but what they were doing is they wanted to build like a studio. They wanted like all the equipment and everything like that. So making Axanar was really just meant to be a way to get the money to build their studio, which when they were then going to use to make lots of other things
Right.
based on the fan money. So most of the money was just going towards the technical side and the building and everything side of things. And so that was the problem. That yes, it would get used to make Axanar, but it was basically this guy getting everyone to give him lots of money to make his studio.
Right.
And also, as was clear from the trailer for Axanar, they were about to produce something that looked like an actual professional Star Trek movie, and they were getting actual Trek actors on it, and they really had gone to the point as far as you could possibly go and call it a fan work at this point. I mean, really, they were beginning to actually rival actual Paramount productions and professional productions. And even Star Trek Continues looks damn nice too. And so I think Paramount justifiably or unjustifiably said that this is it. We're going to clamp down on this, and whatever their motives, whatever their reasons were, it really hurt their relationship with the fan community. I know that, but they definitely wanted to establish their copyright, and they did follow it up by bringing out a new Trek series, which is of course Discovery. Which, have you both seen the trailer for Discovery that came out like about a week ago for the San Diego Comic-Con?
Yeah.
I've seen bits. I try not to watch trailers like that because I just want to see the damn show. But I've seen some bits and pieces from it.
I saw the early trailer, and I saw the one that came out for the San Diego Comic. Correction, I saw half of it, a little more than half, because there's a certain point I actually turned it off and went and watched something else. Because the trailer is basically, oh look, stuff exploding, oh look, Klingons, oh look, stuff exploding, oh look, people running. It looks like a J.J. Abrams Trek movie just in series form, but that may be a marketing thing. It may not actually play out that way, and I'll give them credit that they may do something else with it.
Fair enough.
And so that's why, I'll give it a look when it comes out. Also, it looks, from what I've heard, what you're seeing in the trailer is basically the first 2 or 3 episodes only. We don't actually know how the actual series is going to play out. It's hard to say. But although we do know that the first season is basically effectively serial. Like, it's basically about this one character. There's your character development, Jack, who's comes from a bad place and is basically going into this new situation, and it's not a captain, of course, this time. The character is actually a lower ranked officer, still an officer, but a lower ranked officer. And so we're getting the Trek view in this case from someone working their way up the ranks, so to speak, which could be good. I mean, that could be really
now
awesome.
just can you clarify something for me, because I'm not sure. I know at one point the showrunner wanted to do sort of like 2 and 3 part shows from various different perspectives, not a single character family kind of thing. But then he left. So is that idea gone then too?
As far as I know, yes. He's no longer connected with the show. pretty much right as soon as production started, he got turfed,
Yeah.
and we don't know exactly why. The general guess is that again he started fighting with the producers, and so they got rid of him and they replaced him with someone else who would probably do more of what the producers wanted to do.
Right.
And everything I've seen says that this is basically a show about this character working her way up the ranks, and that the first season will basically be kind of one giant arc, the first 13 episodes or so. The great irony is it's already from a financial point of view, it's already a hit.
Mm-hmm.
This is it hasn't even aired yet because Netflix paid for the global rights for it, and apparently they paid so much that the whole production budget is already paid.
Wow.
Wow. So does this mean we're going to watch
that
it on
show makes at
Netflix
this
now?
Point is... No, we're not, because we're Canadians.
Oh.
Mm-hmm.
We are going to be watching it on Space, the Imagination
Oh.
station, or their website if you want, because they got the Canadian rights. In the States, it's going to be on CBS All Access, which is CBS's new wannabe Netflix,
Right.
which is just all CBS stuff. And the rest of the planet will see it on Netflix.
Yikes.
So literally everywhere else in the world gets it on, Japan, wherever. They're all going to watch it on Netflix. That's why Netflix paid so much, is they got the worldwide rights except for North America. And so we'll see. A lot will depend on how it does. I mean, yes, it's already made a profit, but they will probably want to see how it does before, because Netflix is the main money person here. Whether they'll decide whether it's worth continuing.
Yeah.
Right.
I have noticed that the fan interest in it is really subdued, like for less than what you'd think it is for a trend.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
that's probably good, because the way the internet works, I'm surprised that people aren't like, oh my god, the ship has a green light here. This is the worst thing ever. We have to protest. So,
They already have.
Oh, fantastic.
They totally hated. They already, because last year they revealed the design of the
Uh-huh.
ship, which is of course one of the early. If you'd recognize the design, it's one of the Star Trek Phase 2
Yeah.
designs. It's what the Enterprise was supposed to look like in Phase
Yeah.
2. And when the people saw that, they freaked out, and they hated it, and it was the most horrible thing ever, and they just did not like it at all. But from what we can tell, it's still the design they're using. At least a modified
Right.
version of that is still the design they're using for the
oh,
Discovery.
fantastic.
So there's already been a lot of fan hoo-ha, but a lot of it is still really subdued.
Uh-huh.
Like, compared to what you might expect. Like, there's a huge cultural wave for lots of things coming out, like, the Justice League movie, or, Infinity War, or whatever, all this stuff. But new Star Trek series, people are like, okay, well, maybe I'll check it out. I mean, that seems to be the feeling.
There is a big push because there's a female captain again. So there's and she's a minority.
Officer, not a captain. Yeah,
She's a minority. So that's a big push today. So.
Well, in a minority in North America. In Africa, she's not.
No, of course not. Yeah.
But yes, I'm presuming Netflix Africa will have it too. But which is good. I mean, that's part of the whole global push, right? And you can tell looking at it that if you look at the crew composition, it's very diverse crew. There's no question on that. Apparently, there are also going to be openly gay characters on it, which that's good too. That's no problem there.
Never happened in Star Trek before.
Not really, no. I mean, there's been characters that kind of they've implied might
That's
be
right.
gay, but they've never actually come out.
And
done
aliens
it.
that brought up that idea. I remember they had an alien in Next Gen that brought up that whole idea that they could have various different relationships. But a main character. It's been a big bugaboo in the LGBT community that it's never been a main character. So.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, although they're lucky actually, because if there was a Netflix China, that would never happen.
Oh.
Or it couldn't happen because China just banned all LGBT representation in television and film.
Really?
And China, they did. They did it 2 weeks ago.
I didn't know that.
And China
I know Russia's a problem with that, but I didn't know China did.
No, they did. Nope, China just banned all LGBT. So here's the deal, okay? China is the world's biggest and most profitable movie market. And TV, actually, but not as much for TV, but movies. Hey, so guess what? There will be no big movies with major LGBT characters from now.
Wow.
China has, by default, by being so big and so financially important, no studio will risk it. It just will not happen. They've effectively cut it off at the knees. They didn't do it on purpose in the sense that they weren't trying for Hollywood. They've got their own issues with it. and they're kind of conservative, so
Yeah, kind of.
just like Russia.
Just a touch.
Yeah, just a little conservative. Yeah, exactly, just a little. It's not good, but that's unfortunately the case. So any LGBT stuff that can't be easily removed from the film will just not happen. So don't expect to see major gay. So again, Netflix has no Netflix China though, so therefore it's not an issue with China. So therefore not a problem. And even then, to be honest, I wouldn't be surprised since they do service some countries that are more conservative. I wouldn't be surprised that the LGBT content in Discovery is probably easily removable.
Right.
Just for that very
That
purpose.
the problem that you're running into too, that I'm kind of like amazed at. Like I was saying, like I'm amazed the internet isn't like screaming about that. Political correctness out of control. So, because that's I think.
Oh, there's a fair amount of that too. There's a lot of people that aren't not that interested because they're basically looking at it as Star Trek: The Social Justice Edition. There's a lot of people on the internet that are seeing it that way and are just not interested because of that.
And I think that's one of the problems you have doing Trek was from its inception. It was essentially like a very SJW show, just because it was supposed to be, this idea that we're not that different. We can all get along. Quit being fucking stupid. And the problem you run into nowadays, that attitude, as soon as that comes up at all, you've got people that just, scream up the devil over it.
Well, it's become a point of contention, and I would argue, I don't want to get into this in this episode, but I would just quickly argue that that's at least partly because of the media, and it's partly because of people with agendas on both sides. And I think it's basically a kind of ginned up thing. I think your average person doesn't really care either way. I think that it's just the people who are trying to get clicks, and the people who are trying to get eyeballs on their stuff, and the people who want to make a certain amount of anyway, people that are trying to take advantage of the situation are driving a lot of this stuff, and unfortunately, it is turning some people off in different ways on different sides. In fact, here, I can say both sides, and the audience, at least, and you know what I'm talking about, which automatically tells you that they've succeeded. They've actually divided people up. There's now the SJW camp, and then there's the anti-SJW camp or whatever, or the far right camp or whatever they refer to them as, and or the people who are on the wrong side of history. And so.
Probably Nazis.
Probably Nazis.
That's what they usually go with. So
they're probably Nazis. We'll go with that. There's the SJWs and the probably Nazis. And so we've got these two groups that are battling for the soul of the internet and soul of humanity or whatever. And anyway, it's having fallout, and part of that fallout is affecting.
And you know what? It's funny because I think we've answered the big question. Is Star Trek still relevant? No, because we're all a bunch of asshats who can't get our shit together long enough to actually achieve anything.
You may be correct.
We suck.
You may be correct that. Is it still relevant? I would argue from an idealistic point of view that I think it is good to watch Star Trek. I think it has a good spirit and a good idea to it and everything. But I would also argue that I see that spirit being... Now, again, I can't be quite sure about Discovery yet because it hasn't aired yet, but I kind of see that spirit being degraded. I see it being just basically used as a generic action-adventure show setting at this point, and losing a lot of the elements that actually made it Star Trek. And I have a horrible feeling that that's how Discovery is going to play out. But then again, they did bring Harry Mudd back, so there is a possibility there. No, he's apparently a character, pops up in a couple episodes of this.
And you know who plays him, right?
No.
Who is
it?
It?
What's his name from The Office? What's his name? The foil in The Office to the main character of Jim.
Oh, you mean the guy who plays
yes.
Dwight?
Yeah, that actor.
Oh, his name
I can't remember either.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
They had him, and I thought that was a pretty clever casting, actually.
Okay, that could work. I mean, he's a young Harry.
Oh yeah,
course,
well, it takes place earlier,
before.
right? So he hasn't put on the weight yet, but he does have that kind of sarcastic, sort of snarly thing that Harry Mudd can do. So
Yeah, and that's the one thing that gives me a little bit of hope, because I look at it and go, okay, maybe this isn't going to be Star Trek Battlestar Galactica 2.0
yeah.
after all. And so maybe there's going to be a little hope here. But speaking of hope, now here's the weird thing. I've seen on the Trek forums that a lot of people are more excited about the Orville, Seth MacFarlane's Trek show, than they are Discovery. Partly because it literally looks like Star Trek: The Next Generation, with better effects, sort of, and better better effects. Anyway, but it looks like it might actually be just kind of entertaining and fun, and might actually be. Okay, I don't think it's going to be good, but it might be entertaining. Okay, we'll go.
I think what the problem is the Galaxy Quest television show fell through, and he snuck through in the cracks for that. Let's be honest, Seth MacFarlane has a very terrible reputation when it comes to live action shows. For the most part, he just can't land them. They're not funny. They're not interesting. They're not well done. The people that I know on Facebook are taking bets as to how many episodes it'll be before it gets canceled. It is on Fox, right?
And I think they're right. I think it'll probably only last 5 or 6 episodes, and that'll probably...
Right.
Will it out-survive Firefly is the big question, right? So...
But I will admit it is very Trek. I mean, it's very obviously a Star Trek / Galaxy Quest series, and it might be entertaining.
Well, Galaxy Quest is obviously a Trek parody, too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, so yeah, I mean, actually, many people consider Galaxy Quest one of the best Trek movies ever made.
I will say, and I've said this before, Galaxy Quest is probably one of the most perfect comedic action scripts I've ever seen. As a script, it's got very few problems with it, so it's very well done.
It's very tight. I agree. They do a good job with it. So, is Trek relevant? I mean, I guess it depends on what you mean. The other thing, going back to what I mentioned earlier, where I was mentioning about, well, did Trek really have that much competition? Well, now Trek does have competition. This is the other reason why maybe people aren't that interested. Is there's a lot of other sci-fi out there that they could be watching. I mean, Star Trek has to earn its place now, which it didn't once upon a time. It was just the king of the hill. Now it's just another sci-fi show on TV. I can go watch spaceships blow up any number of shows right now if I want to. I can watch sci-fi action, whatever. It's going to have to deliver something that these other shows are not giving. And ironically enough, that might actually be the Star Trek spirit, but whether they have it or not.
Well, I would argue that those other shows have to compete with the original Star Trek, because everything else is basically a derivative of Star Trek in that respect. You're either a derivative of Star Trek or you're a derivative of Star Wars. Star Trek itself, the original Star Trek, broke all the boundaries that all the other shows were either trying to make pace with or trying to break and not do. Because everything they did in the original series, they broke all those particular taboos. All of our technology has been based upon. You don't see technology based on the stuff from Logan's Run.
Not yet.
Not yet. No, I'm just saying the flip phone was absolutely inspired by the communicator. There's doctors' diagnostic beds which look exactly like the sick bay beds. They've already come out with the tricorder 1.0. I mean, the pad look from the Star Trek Next Generation pad even. All this stuff has become part of our future. Siri, all those things of our future. So Star Trek doesn't have to remain to be relevant in my respect. It's created the future that it's wanted. It has been the solar punk that we've talked about that everybody's trying to grab again. Can you think of another show that has had that effect of hopeful future science adventure, blah, 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 that Star Trek has? I can't think of another one, Quark. No, everybody hated poor Quark and his crew.
Not everybody.
Almost everybody. Yeah. I don't mean people who actually watch the show. I just mean in his universe, he wasn't liked. So go ahead.
That's true. That's true. All right. So on that note, we're going to bring this episode to a close. Thank you everyone for listening, and we hope we've given you a interesting and entertaining journey through the Final Frontier. And who knows, maybe we'll be back at some point to discuss Star Trek Discovery once it does its run, and who knows? Maybe it will be the new genesis of Trek. Maybe it will actually, give birth to a new generation of Trek fans, and Trek will continue to live long and prosper.
Was that a Genesis Planet reference there you were just making? Good night. Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to the show. If you'd like to hear more or join the conversation, come visit us at obeythedna.com. You can also find us on iTunes or whatever fine podcast site forgot to lock their back door. So until next time, remember that to master the nerdly arts takes time, practice, and enough Coca-Cola to drop a rhino. See ya! Come on over and join the conversation at obeythedna.com, where you will find show notes and more.